Chapter 11 of Our Village, Volume 1, by Mary Russell Mitford, read by Anne Fletcher, Hobart 2020. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Village, Volume 1. Chapter 11, A Country Cricket Match. I doubt if there be any scene in the world more animating or delightful than a cricket match. I do not mean a set match at Lord's ground for money, hard money, between a certain number of gentlemen and players, as they are called, people who make a trade of that noble sport and degrade it into an affair of bettings and hedgings and cheatings, it may be, like boxing or horse racing. Nor do I mean a pretty fete in a gentleman's park, where one club of cricketing dandies encounter another such club, and where they show off in graceful costume to a gay marquis of admiring belles, who condescend so to purchase admiration, and while away a long summer morning in partaking cold collations and conversing occasionally, and seeming to understand the game. The whole being conducted according to ballroom etiquette, so as to be exceedingly elegant and exceedingly dull. No, the cricket that I mean is a real solid old-fashioned match between neighbouring parishes, where each attacks the other for honour and a supper, glory and half a crown a man. If there be any gentleman amongst them, it is well. If not, it is so much the better. Your gentleman cricketer is in general rather an anomalous character. Elderly gentlemen are obviously good for nothing, and young beaux are, for the most part, hampered and trammelled by dress and habit. The stiff cravat, the pinched-in waist, the dandy walk, they will never do for cricket. Now our country lads, accustomed to the flail or the hammer, your blacksmiths are capital hitters, have the free use of their arms, they know how to move their shoulders, and they can move their feet too. They can run. Then they are so much better made, so much more athletic, and yet so much lissomer, to use a Hampshire phrase, which deserves at least to be good English. Here and there, indeed, one meets with an old Etonian who retains his boyish love for that game which forms so considerable a branch of his education. Some even preserve their boyish proficiency, but in general it wears away like the Greek, quite as certainly and almost as fast. A few years of Oxford or Cambridge or the Continent are sufficient to annihilate both the power and the inclination. No, a village match is the thing, where our highest officer, our conductor, to borrow a musical term, is but a little farmer's second son, where a day labourer is our bowler, and a blacksmith our long-stop, where the spectators consist of the retired cricketers, the veterans of the green, the careful mothers, the girls, and all the boys of two parishes, together with a few amateurs, little above them in rank, and not at all in pretension, where laughing and shouting and the very ecstasy of merriment and good humour prevail. Such a match, in short, as I attended yesterday, at the expense of getting twice wet through, and as I would attend tomorrow at the certainty of having that ducking doubled. For the last 3 weeks, our village has been in a state of great excitement, occasioned by a challenge from our north-western neighbours, the men of B, to contend with us at cricket. Now, we have not been much in the habit of playing matches. 3 or 4 years ago, indeed, we encountered the men of S, our neighbours south by east, with a sort of doubtful success, beating them on our own ground, whilst they in the second match returned the compliment on theirs. This discouraged us. Then an unnatural coalition between a high church curate and an evangelical gentleman farmer drove our lads from the Sunday evening practice, which, as it did not begin before both services were concluded, and as it tended to keep young men from the alehouse, our magistrates had winked at, if not encouraged. The sport, therefore, had languished until the present season, when, under another change of circumstances, the spirit began to revive. Half a dozen fine, active lads of influence amongst their comrades grew into men and yearned for cricket, An enterprising publican gave a set of ribbons, and his rival, mine host of the Rose, an outdoer by profession, gave 2, and the clergyman and his lay ally, both well-disposed and good-natured men, gratified by the submission to their authority, and finding perhaps that no great good resulted from the substitution of public houses for out-of-doors diversions, relaxed. In short, the practice recommenced, and the hill was again alive with men and boys and innocent merriment. But farther than the ribbon matches amongst ourselves nobody dreamed of going till this challenge. We were modest and doubted our own strength. The bee people, on the other hand, must have been braggers born, a whole parish of Gasconaders. Never was such boasting, such crowing, such ostentatious display of practice, such mutual compliments from man to man, bowler to batter, batter to bowler. It was a wonder they didn't challenge all England. It must be confessed that we were a little astounded, yet we firmly resolved not to decline the combat. And one of the most spirited of the new growth, William Gray by name, took up the glove in a style of manly courtesy that would have done honour to a knight in the days of chivalry. We were not professed players, he said, being little better than schoolboys and scarcely older, but since they had done us the honour to challenge us, we would try our strength. It would be no discredit to be beaten by such a field. Having accepted the wager of battle, our champion began forthwith to collect his forces. William Gray is himself one of the finest youths that one shall see. Tall, active, slender and yet strong, with a piercing eye full of sagacity and a smile full of good humour. A farmer's son by station, and used to hard work as farmers' sons are now, liked by everybody and admitted to be an excellent cricketer. He immediately set forth to muster his men, remembering with great complacency that Samuel Long, a bowler comme il y en a peu, the very man who had knocked down 9 wickets, who had beaten us and bowled us out at the fatal return match some years ago at S, had luckily, in a remove of 1/4 of a mile last Lady Day, crossed the boundaries of his old parish and actually belonged to us. Here was a stroke of good fortune. Our captain applied to him instantly, and he agreed at a word. Indeed, Samuel Long is a very civilized person. He is a middle-aged man who looks rather old amongst our young lads, and whose thickness and breadth give no token of remarkable activity. But he is very active, and so steady a player, so safe. We'd half gained the match when we secured him. He is a man of substance, too, in every way. Owns 1 cow, 2 donkeys, 6 pigs, and geese and ducks beyond count. Dresses like a farmer, and owes no man a shilling. And all this from pure industry, sheer day labour. Note that your good cricketer is commonly the most industrious man in the parish. The habits that make him such are precisely those which make a good workman: steadiness, sobriety, and activity. Samuel Long might pass for the beau ideal of the 2 characters. Happy we were to possess him. Then we had another piece of good luck. James Brown, a journeyman blacksmith and a native, who, being of a rambling disposition, had roamed from place to place for 6 years, had just returned to settle with his brother at another corner of our village, bringing with him a prodigious reputation in cricket and in gallantry, the gay Lothario of the neighbourhood. He is said to have made more conquests in love and in cricket than any blacksmith in the county. To him also went the indefatigable William Gray, and he also consented to play. No end to our good fortune. Another celebrated batter, called Joseph Hearn, had likewise recently married into the parish. He worked, it is true, at the A mills, but slept at the house of his wife's father in our territories. He also was sought and found by our leader. But he was grand and shy, made an immense favour of the thing, courting, and then hung back. Didn't know that he could be spared. Had partly resolved not to play again, at least not this season. Thought it rash to accept the challenge. Thought they might do without him. Truly, I think so too, said our spirited champion. Will not trouble you, Mr. Hearn. Having thus secured 2 powerful auxiliaries and rejected a third, we began to reckon and select the regular native forces. Thus ran our list. William Gray, 1. Samuel Long, 2. James Brown, 3. George and John Simmons, 1 capital, the other so-so. An uncertain hitter but a good fieldsman, 5. Joel Brent, excellent, 6. Ben Appleton. Here was a little pause. Ben's abilities at cricket were not completely ascertained, but then he was so good a fellow, so full of fun and waggery. No doing without Ben. So he figured in the list. 7. George Harris. A short halt there too. Slowish, slow but sure. I think the proverb brought him in. 8. Tom Coper. Oh, beyond the world, Tom Coper, the red-headed gardening lad whose left-handed strokes send her, a cricket ball, like that other moving thing, a ship, is always of the feminine gender, send her spinning a mile. 9. And Harry Willis, another blacksmith, 10. We now had 10 of our 11, but the choice of the last occasioned some demur. 3 young Martins, rich farmers of the neighbourhood, successively presented themselves, and were all rejected by our independent and impartial general for want of merit, a cricketal merit. Not good enough, was his pithy answer. Then our worthy neighbour, the half-pay lieutenant, offered his services. He too, though with some hesitation and modesty, was refused. Not quite young enough, was his sentence. John Strong, the exceedingly long son of our dwarfish mason, was the next candidate. A nice youth, everybody likes John Strong, and a willing, but so tall and so limp, bent in the middle, a thread paper 6 feet high. We were all afraid that in spite of his name, his strength would never hold out. Wait till next year, John, quoth William Gray, with all the dignified seniority of 20 speaking to 18. Coper's a year younger, said John. And Coper's a foot shorter, replied William. So John retired, and the 11th man remained unchosen, almost to the 11th hour. The eve of the match arrived, and the post was still vacant, when a little boy of 15, David Willis, brother to Harry, admitted by accident to the last praxis, saw 8 of them out and was voted in by acclamation. That Sunday evening's practice, for Monday was the important day, was a period of great anxiety, and to say the truth of great pleasure. There's something strangely delightful in the innocent spirit of party. To be one of a numerous body, to be authorised to say we, to have a rightful interest in triumph or defeat, is gratifying at once to social feeling and to personal pride. There was not a 10-years-old urchin or a septuagenary woman in the parish who did not feel an additional importance, a reflected consequence, in speaking of our side. An election interests in the same way, but that feeling is less pure. Money is there, and hatred, and politics and lies. Oh, to be a voter or a voter's wife comes nothing near the genuine and hearty sympathy of belonging to a parish, breathing the same air, looking on the same trees, and listening to the same nightingales. Talk of a patriotic elector? Give me a parochial patriot, a man who loves his parish. Even we, the female partisans, may partake the common ardour. I'm sure I did. I never, though tolerably eager and enthusiastic at all times, remember being in a more delicious state of excitation than on the eve of that battle. Our hopes waxed stronger and stronger. Those of our players who were present were excellent. William Gray got 40 notches off his own bat, and that brilliant hitter Tom Coper gained 8 from 2 successive balls. As the evening advanced, too, we had encouragement of another sort. A spy, who had been dispatched to reconnoitre the enemy's quarters, returned from their practising ground with a most consolatory report. "Really," said Charles Grover, our intelligencer, a fine old steady judge, one who had played well in his day, "they're no better than so many old women. Any 5 of ours would beat their 11. This sent us to bed in high spirits. Morning dawned less favourably. The sky promised a series of deluging showers, and kept its word, as English skies are wont to do on such occasions, and a lamentable message arrived at the headquarters from our trusty comrade Joel Brent. His master, a great farmer, had begun the hay harvest that very morning, and Joel, being as eminent in one field as in another, could not be spared. Imagine Joel's plight, the most ardent of our 11, a knight held back from the tourney, a soldier from the battle. The poor swain was inconsolable. At last, one who is always ready to do a good-natured action, great or little, set forth to back his petition, and by dint of appealing to the public spirit of our worthy neighbour and the state of the barometer, talking alternately of the parish honour and thunder showers, of lost matches and sopped hay, he carried his point, and returned triumphantly with the delighted Joel. In the meantime, we became sensible of another defalcation. On calling over our roll, Brown was missing, and the spy of the preceding night, Charles Grover, the universal scout and messenger of the village, a man who will run a half-dozen miles for a pint of beer, who does errands for the very love of the trade, who, if he had been a lord, would have been an ambassador, was instantly dispatched to summon the truant. His report spread general consternation. Brown had set off at 4 o'clock in the morning to play in a cricket match at M, a little town 12 miles off, which had been his last residence. Here was desertion. Here was treachery. Here was treachery against that goodly state, our parish. To send James Brown to Coventry was the immediate resolution, but even that seemed too light a punishment for such delinquency. Then how we cried him down. At 10 on Sunday night, for the rascal had actually practised with us and never said a word of his intended disloyalty. He was our faithful mate and the best player, taken for all in all, of all the 11. At 10 in the morning he had run away, and we were well rid of him. He was no batter compared with William Gray or Tom Coper, not fit to wipe the shoes of Samuel Long as a bowler, and nothing of a scout to John Simmons. The boy David Willis was worth 50 of him. I trust we have within our realm 500 good as he, was the universal sentiment. So we took tall John Strong, who, with an incurable hankering after the honour of being admitted, had kept constantly with the players, to take the chance of some such accident. We took John for our pis-aller. I never saw any one prouder than the good-humoured lad was of this not very flattering piece of preferment. John Strong was elected, and Brown sent to Coventry, and when I first heard of his delinquency, I thought the punishment only too mild for the crime. But I have since learned the secret history of the offence. If we could know the secret histories of all offences, how much better the world would seem than it does now. And really, my wrath is much abated. It was a piece of gallantry, of devotion to the sex, or rather a chivalrous obedience to the one chosen fair. I must tell my readers the story. Mary Allen, the prettiest girl of M, had, it seems, revenged upon our blacksmith the numberless inconstancies of which he stood accused. He was in love over head and ears, but the nymph was cruel. She said no, and no, and no. And poor Brown, 3 times rejected, at last resolved to leave the place, partly in despair, and partly in that hope which often mingles strangely with the lover's despair, the hope that when he was gone he would be missed. He came home to his brothers accordingly, but for 5 weeks he heard nothing from or of the inexorable Mary, and was glad to beguile his own vexing thoughts by endeavouring to create in his mind an artificial and factitious interest in our cricket match, all unimportant as such a trifle must have seemed to a man in love. Poor James, however, is a social and warm-hearted person, not likely to resist a contagious sympathy. As the time for the play advanced, the interest which he had first affected became genuine and sincere, and he was really, when he left the ground on Sunday night, almost as enthusiastically absorbed in the event of the next day as Joel Brent himself. He little foresaw the new and delightful interest which awaited him at home, where on the moment of his arrival his sister-in-law and confidante presented him with a billet from the lady of his heart. It had, with the usual delay of letters sent by private hands in that rank of life, loitered on the road, in a degree inconceivable to those who were accustomed to the punctual speed of the post, and had taken 10 days for its 12-mile journey. Have my readers any wish to see this billet doux? I can show them, but in strict confidence, a literal copy. It was addressed, "For Mr. Jem Brown, blacksmith, by S." The inside ran thus: "Mr. Brown, this is to inform you that our parish plays Bramley Men next Monday is a week. I think we shall lose without you. From your humble servant to command, Mary Allen." Oh, was there ever a prettier relenting, a summons more flattering, more delicate and more irresistible? This precious epistle was undated, but having ascertained who brought it, and found, by cross-examining the messenger, that the Monday in question was the very next day, we were not surprised to find that Mr. Brown forgot his engagement to us, forgot all but Mary and Mary's letter, and set off at 4 o'clock the next morning to walk 12 miles and play for her parish and in her sight. Really, we must not send James Brown to Coventry, must we? Though if, as his sister-in-law tells our damsel Harriet he hopes to do, he should bring the fair Mary home as his bride, he will not greatly care how little we say to him. But he must not be sent to Coventry. True love forbid. At last we were all assembled, and marched down to H Common, the appointed ground, which, though in our dominions, according to the map, was the constant practising place of our opponents, and terra incognita to us. We found our adversaries on the ground as we expected, for our various delays had hindered us from taking the field so early as we wished, and as soon as we had settled all preliminaries, the match began. But alas, I've been so long settling my preliminaries that I have left myself no room for the detail of our victory, and must squeeze the account of our grand achievements into as little compass as Cowley, when he crammed the names of 11 of his mistresses into the narrow space of 4 8-syllable lines. They began the warfare, those boastful men of B. And what think you, gentle reader, was the amount of their innings? These challengers, the famous 11, how many did they get? Think, imagine, guess. You cannot? Well, they got 22, or rather they got 20, for 2 of theirs were short notches and would never have been allowed, only that seeing what they were made of, we and our umpires were not particular. They should have had 20 more if they'd chosen to claim them. Oh, how well we fielded, and how well we bowled! Our good play had quite as much to do with their miserable failure as their bad. Samuel Long is a slow bowler, and George Simmons a fast one, and the change from Long's lobbing to Simmons' fast balls posed them completely. Oh, poor simpletons, they were always wrong, expecting the slow for the quick and the quick for the slow. Well, we went in. And what were our innings? Guess again. Guess. 169, in spite of soaking showers and wretched ground where the ball would not run a yard. We headed them by 147. And then they gave in, as well they might. William Gray pressed them much to try another innings. There was so much chance, as he courteously observed, in cricket, that advantageous as our position seemed, we might very possibly be overtaken. The B-men had better try. But they were beaten sulky, and would not move, to my great disappointment. I wanted to prolong the pleasure of success. What a glorious sensation it is to be for 5 hours together winning, and winning, always feeling what a whist player feels when he takes up 4 honours and 7 trumps. Who would think that a little bit of leather and 2 pieces of wood had such a delightful and delighting power? The only drawback on my enjoyment was the failure of the pretty boy David Willis, who injudiciously put in first, and playing for the first time in a match amongst men and strangers, who talked to him and stared at him, was seized with such a fit of shame-faced shyness that he could scarcely hold his bat, and was bowled out without a stroke from actual nervousness. He will come of that, Tom Coper says. I'm afraid he will. I wonder whether Tom had ever any modesty to lose. Our other modest lad, John Strong, did very well. His length told in fielding, and he got good fame. Joel Brent, the rescued mower, got into a scrape and out of it again, his fortune for the day. He ran out his mate, Samuel Long, who I do believe, but for the excess of Joel's eagerness, would have stayed in till this time, by which exploit he got into sad disgrace. And then he himself got 37 runs, which redeemed his reputation. William Gray made a hit which actually lost the cricket ball. We think she lodged in a hedge 1/4 of a mile off, but nobody could find her. And George Simmons nearly lost his shoe, which he tossed away in a passion for having been caught out, owing to the ball glancing against it. These, together with a very complete summerset of Ben Appleton, our long stop, who floundered about in the mud, making faces and attitudes as laughable as Grimaldi, none could tell whether by accident or design, were the chief incidents of the scene of action. Amongst the spectators nothing remarkable occurred, beyond the general calamity of 2 or 3 drenchings, except that a form, placed by the side of a hedge under a very insufficient shelter, was knocked into the ditch in a sudden rush of the cricketers to escape a pelting shower, by which means all parties shared the fate of Ben Appleton, some on land and some by water, and that, amidst the scramble, a saucy gipsy of a girl contrived to steal from the knee of the demure and well-apparelled Samuel Long a smart handkerchief, which his careful dame had tied round it to preserve his new— what is the mincing feminine word? His new inexpressibles, thus reversing the story of Desdemona and causing the new Othello to call aloud for his handkerchief, to the great diversion of the company. And so we parted. The players retired to their supper, and we to our homes, all wet through and all good-humoured and all happy, except the losers. Today we are happy too. Hats with ribbons in them go glancing up and down, and William Gray says with a proud humility, "We do not challenge any parish, but if we be challenged, we are ready." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Our Village, Volume 1, by Mary Russell Mitford. Read by Anne Fletcher, Hobart, 2020. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Village, Volume 1. Chapter 12. Tom Cordery. There are certain things and persons that look as if they could never die. Things of such vigour and hardiness that they seem constituted for an interminable duration, a sort of immortality. An old pollard oak of my acquaintance used to give me this impression. Never was tree so gnarled, so knotted, so full of crooked life, garlanded with ivy and woodbine, almost bending under the weight of its own rich leaves and acorns, tough, vigorous, lusty, concentrating as it were the very spirit of vitality into its own curtailed proportions. Could that tree ever die? I have asked myself 20 times as I stood looking on the deep water over which it hung and in which it seemed to live again, would that strong dwarf ever fall? Alas, the question is answered. Walking by the spot today, this very day, there it lay prostrate, the ivy still clinging about it, the twigs swelling with sap and putting forth already the early buds. There it lay, a victim to the taste and skill of some admirer of British woods, who, with the tact of Ugo Foscolo, that prince of amateurs, has discovered in the knots and gnarls of the exterior coat the leopard-like beauty which is concealed within the trunk. There it lies, a type of sylvan instability, fallen like an emperor. Another piece of strong nature in a human form used to convey to me exactly the same feeling. And he is gone too. Tom Cordery is dead. The bell is tolling for him at this very moment. Tom Cordery dead. The words seem almost a contradiction. One is tempted to send for the sexton and the undertaker to undig the grave, to force open the coffin lid. There must be some mistake. But alas, it's too true. The typhus fever, that axe which levels the strong as the weak, has hewed him down at a blow. Poor Tom Cordery. This human oak grew on the wild north of Hampshire country, of which I have before made honourable mention, a country of heath and hill and forest, partly reclaimed, enclosed, and planted by some of the greater proprietors, but for the most part uncultivated and uncivilized. A proper refuge for wild animals of every species. Of these, the most notable was my friend Tom Cordery, who presented in his own person no unfit emblem of the district in which he lived, the gentlest of savages, the wildest of civilized men. He was by calling rat-catcher, hare-finder, and broom-maker, a triad of trades which he had substituted for the one grand profession of poaching, which he followed in his younger days with unrivalled talent and success, and would undoubtedly have pursued till his death, had not the bursting of an overloaded gun unluckily shot off his left hand. As it was, he still contrived to mingle a little of his old unlawful occupation with his honest callings, was a reference of high authority among the young aspirants, an adviser of undoubted honour and secrecy, suspected and more than suspected as being one who, though he played no more or looked the cards, yet he kept to windward of the law, and indeed contrived to be on such terms of social and even friendly intercourse with the guardians of the game on M Common as may be said to prevail between reputed thieves and the myrmidons of justice in the neighbourhood of Bow Street. Indeed, his especial crony, the head keeper, used sometimes to hint, when Tom, elevated by ale, had provoked him by overcrowing, that a stump was no bad shield, and that to shoot off a hand and a bit of an arm for a blind would be nothing to so daring a chap as Tom Cordery. This conjecture, never broached till the keeper was warm with wrath and liquor, and Tom fairly out of hearing, seemed always to me a little super-subtle. But it is certain that Tom's new professions did bear rather a suspicious analogy to the old, and the ferrets and terriers and mongrels by whom he was surrounded did really look, as the worthy keeper observed, fitter to find Christian hares and pheasants than rats and such vermin. So, in good truth, did Tom himself. Never did any human being look more like that sort of sportsman commonly called a poacher. He was a tall, finely built man, with a prodigious stride that cleared the ground like a horse, and a power of continuing his slow and steady speed that seemed nothing less than miraculous. Neither man, nor horse, nor dog could outtire him. He had a bold, undaunted presence, and an evident strength and power of bone and muscle. You might see by looking at him that he did not know what fear meant. In his youth he had fought more battles than any man in the forest. He was as if born without nerves, totally insensible to the recoils and disgusts of humanity. I have known him take up a huge adder, cut off his head, and then deposit the living and writhing body in his brimless hat, and walk with it coiling and wreathing about his head like another Medusa, till the sport of the day was over, and he carried it home to secure the fat. With all this iron stubbornness of nature, he was of a most mild and gentle demeanour, had a fine placidity of countenance, and a quick blue eye beaming with good humour. His face was sunburnt into one general pale vermilion hue that overspread all his features. His very hair was sunburnt too. His costume was generally a smock frock, of no doubtful complexion, dirt-coloured, which hung around him in tatters like fringe, rather augmenting than diminishing the freedom, and, if I may say so, the gallantry of his bearing. This frock was furnished with a huge inside pocket in which to deposit the game killed by his patrons. For of his 3 employments, that which consisted of finding hares for the great farmers and small gentry, who were wont to course on the common, was by far the most profitable and most pleasing to him and to them. Everybody liked Tom Cordery. He had himself an aptness to like, which is certain to be repaid in kind. The very dogs knew him and loved him, and would beat for him almost as soon as for their master. Even May, the most sagacious of greyhounds, appreciated his talents, and would as soon listen to Tom so hoeing as to old Tray giving tongue. Nor was his conversation less agreeable to the other part of the company. Servants and masters were equally desirous to secure Tom. Besides his general and professional familiarity with beasts and birds, their ways and doings, a knowledge so minute and accurate that it might have put to shame many a professed naturalist, he had no small acquaintance with the goings-on of that unfeathered biped called man. In short, he was, next after Lucy, who recognised his rivalry by hating, decrying, and undervaluing him, by far the best news-gatherer of the countryside. His news he of course picked up on the civilised side of the parish. There is no gossiping in the forest. Partly at that well-frequented inn, the Red Lion, of which Tom was a regular and noted supporter, and partly among his several employers, and partly by his own sagacity. In the matter of marriages, pairings he was wont to call them, he relied chiefly on his own skill in noting certain preliminary indications, and certainly for a guesser by profession, and a very bold one, he was astonishingly often right. At the alehouse especially, he was of the first authority. An air of mild importance, a diplomatic reserve on some points, a great smoothness of speech, and that gentleness which is so often the result of conscious power, made him there an absolute ruler. Perhaps the effect of these causes might be a little aided by the latent dread which that power inspired in others. Many an exploit had proved that Tom Cordery's one arm was fairly worth any 2 on the common. The pommelling of Bob Arlott and the levelling of Jem Searle to the earth by one swing of a huge old hare, which unusual weapon was, by the way, the first slain of Mayflower on its way home to us in that walking cupboard his pocket, when the unlucky rencontre with Jem Searle broke 2 heads, the dead and the living. Arguments such as these might have some cogency at the Red Lion. But he managed everybody, as your gentle-mannered person is apt to do. Even the rude squires and rough farmers, his temporary masters, he managed, particularly as far as concerned the beat, and was sure to bring them round to his own peculiar fancies or prejudices, however strongly their own wishes might turn them aside from the direction indicated, and however often Tom's sagacity in that instance might have been found at fault. 2 spots in the large wild enclosures into which the heath had been divided were his especial favourites. The 100 acres, alias the poor allotment, alias the burnt common. Do any or all of these titles convey any notion of the real destination of that many-named place? a piece of moorland portioned out to serve for fuel to the poor of the parish. This was one. Oh, the barrenness of this miserable moor! Flat, marshy, and dingy, and bare. Here that piece of green treachery a bog. There parched and pared and shrivelled and black with smoke and ashes, utterly desolate and wretched everywhere, except where amidst the desolation blossomed as in mockery the enamelled gentianella. No hares ever came there, they had too much taste, yet thither would Tom lead his unwary employers. Thither, however warned or cautioned or experienced, would he, by reasoning or induction or gentle persuasion or actual fraud, entice the hapless gentleman. And then to see him with his rabble of finders pacing up and down this precious sitting ground, for so was Tom, thriftless liar wont to call it, pretending to look for game, counterfeiting a mers, forging a form, and telling a story some 10 years old of a famous hare once killed on that spot by his honour's favourite bitch, Marigold. I never could thoroughly understand whether it were design, a fear that too many hares might be killed, or a real and honest mistake, a genuine prejudice in favour of the place that influenced Tom Cordery in this point. Half the one, perhaps, and half the other. Mixed motives, let Pope and his disciples say what they will, are by far the commonest in this party-coloured world. Or he had shared the fate of greater men, and lied till he believed, a coursing Cromwell, beginning in hypocrisy and ending in fanaticism. Another pet spot was the gallows piece, an enclosure about as large as the 100 acres, where a gibbet had once borne the bodies of 2 murderers, with the chains and bones, even in my remembrance, clanking and creaking in the wind. The gibbet was gone now, but the name remained, and the feeling, deep, sad, and shuddering. The place, too, was wild, awful, fearful, a heathy, furzy spot, sinking into broken hollows where murderers might lurk, a few withered pines at the upper end, and amongst them, half hidden by the brambles, the stone in which the gallows had been fixed. The bones must have been mouldering beneath. All Tom's eloquence, seconded by 2 capital courses, failed to drag me thither a second time. Tom was not, however, without that strong sense of natural beauty which they who live amongst the wildnesses and fastnesses of nature so often exhibit. One spot where the common trenches on this civilized world were scarcely less his admiration than mine. It is a high hill, half covered with furze and heath and broom, and sinking abruptly down to a large pond, almost a lake, covered with wild waterfowl. The ground, richly clothed with wood, oak and beech and elm, rises on the other side with equal abruptness, as if shutting in those glassy waters from all but the sky, which shines so brightly in their clear bosom. Just in the bottom peeps a small sheltered farm, whose wreaths of light smoke and the white glancing wings of the wild ducks as they flit across the lake are all that give token of motion or of life. I have stood there in utter oblivion of greyhound or of hare, till moments have swelled to minutes and minutes to hours, and so has Tom, conveying by his exclamation of delight at its pleasantness exactly the same feeling which a poet or a painter, for it breathes the very spirit of calm and sunshiny beauty that a master painter loves, would express by different but not truer praise. He called his own home pleasant too, and there, though one loves to hear any home so called, there I must confess that favourite phrase, which I like almost as well as they who have no other, did seem rather misapplied. And yet it was finely placed, very finely. It stood in a sort of defile, where a road almost perpendicular wound from the top of a steep abrupt hill crowned with a tuft of old Scottish firs into a dingle of fern and wild brushwood. A shallow, sullen stream oozed from the bank on one side, and after forming a rude channel across the road, sank into a deep, dark pool, half hidden amongst the sallows. Behind these sallows, in a nook between them and the hill, rose the uncouth and shapeless cottage of Tom Cordery. It is a scene which hangs upon the eye and the memory, striking, grand, almost sublime, and above all, eminently foreign. No English painter would choose such a subject for an English landscape. No one in a picture would take it for English. It might pass for one of those scenes which have furnished models to Salvator Rosa. Tom's cottage was, however, very thoroughly national and characteristic. A low, ruinous hovel, the door of which was fastened with a sedulous attention to security, that contrasted strangely with the tattered thatch of the roof and the half-broken windows. No garden, no pigsty, no pens for geese, none of the usual signs of cottage habitation. Yet the house was covered with nondescript dwellings, and the very walls were animate with their extraordinary tenants. Pheasants, partridges, rabbits, tame wild ducks and half-tame hares, and their enemies by nature and education, the ferrets, terriers, and mongrels, of whom his retinue consisted. Great ingenuity had been evinced in keeping separate these jarring elements, and by dint of hutches, cages, fences, and kennels, and half a dozen little hurdled enclosures, resembling the sort of courts which children are apt to build around their card-houses, peace was in general tolerably well preserved. Frequent sounds, however, of fear or of anger, as their several instincts were aroused, gave tokens that it was but a forced and hollow truce, and at such times the clamour was prodigious. Tom had the remarkable tenderness for animals when domesticated, which is so often found in those whose sole vocation seems to be their destruction in the field. And the one long, straggling, unceilinged barn-like room, which served for kitchen, bedchamber, and hall, was cumbered with bipeds and quadrupeds of all kinds and descriptions, the sick, the delicate, the newly caught, the lying in. In the midst of this menagerie sat Tom's wife, for he was married, though without a family, married to a woman lame of a leg, as he himself was minus an arm, now trying to quiet her noisy inmates, and now to outscold them. How long his friend the keeper would have continued to wink at this den of live game, none can say. The roof fairly fell in during the deep snow of last winter, killing, as poor Tom observed, 2 as fine litters of rabbits as ever were kittened. Remotely, I have no doubt that he himself fell a sacrifice to this misadventure. The overseer, to whom he applied to reinstate his beloved habitation, decided that the walls would never bear another roof, and removed him and his wife, as an especial favour, to a tidy, snug, comfortable room in the workhouse. The workhouse! From that hour poor Tom visibly altered. He lost his hilarity and independence. It was a change such as he himself had often inflicted, a complete change of habits, a transition from the wild to the tame. No labour was demanded of him. He went about as before, finding hares, killing rats, selling brooms, but the spirit of the man was departed. He talked of the quiet of his old abode and the noise of the new, complained of children and other bad company, and looked down on his neighbours with the sort of contempt with which a cock-pheasant might regard a barn-door fowl. Most of all did he, braced into a gipsy-like defiance of wet and cold, grumble at the warmth and dryness of his apartment. He used to foretell that it would kill him, and assuredly it did so. Never could the typhus fever have found out that wild hillside, or have lurked under that broken roof. The free touch of the air would have chased the demon. Alas, poor Tom! Warmth and snugness and comfort, whole windows and an entire ceiling, were the death of him. Alas, poor Tom! End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Our Village, Volume 1, by Mary Russell Mitford. Read by Anne Fletcher, Hobart 2020. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Village, Volume 1, Chapter 13, An Old Bachelor. There is no effect of the subtle operation of the association of ideas more universal and more curious than the manner in which the most trivial circumstances recall particular persons to our memory. Sometimes these glances of recollection are purely pleasurable. Thus, I have a double liking for May Day, as being the birthday of a dear friend whose fair idea burst upon me with the first sunbeam of that glad morning, and I can never hear certain airs of Mozart and Handel without seeming to catch an echo of that sweetest voice in which I first learnt to love them. Pretty often, however, the point of association is less elegant, and occasionally it's tolerably ludicrous. We happened today to have for dinner a couple of wild ducks, the first of the season, and as the master of the house, who is so little of an epicure that I'm sure he would never, while he lived, out of its feathers know a wild duck from a tame, whilst he, with little affectation of science, was squeezing the lemon and mixing cayenne pepper with the gravy, two of us exclaimed in a breath, "Poor Mr. Sidney!" "Ay," rejoined the squeezer of lemons, "poor Sidney! I think he would have allowed that these ducks were done even to half a turn." And then he told the story more elaborately to a young visitor, to whom Mr. Sidney was unknown. How, after eating the best parts of a couple of wild ducks, which all the company pronounced to be the finest and best dressed wild ducks ever brought to table, that judicious critic in the gastronomic art limited the too sweeping praise by gravely asserting that the birds were certainly excellent, and that the cookery would have been excellent also, had they not been roasted half a turn too much. Mr. Sidney has been dead these 15 years, but no wild ducks have ever appeared on our homely board without recalling that observation. It is his memorable saying, his one good thing. Mr. Sidney was, as might be conjectured, an epicure. He was also an old bachelor, a clergyman, and senior fellow of a certain college, a post which he had long filled, being, although only a second son, so well provided for that he could afford to reject living after living in expectation of one favourite rectory, to which he had taken an early fancy from the pleasantness of the situation and the imputed salubrity of the air. Of the latter quality, indeed, he used to give an instance, which, however satisfactory as confirming his prepossession, could hardly have been quite agreeable as preventing him from gratifying it, namely, the extraordinary and provoking longevity of the incumbent, who at upwards of 90 gave no sign of decay, and bade fair to emulate the age of old Pa. Whilst waiting for the expected living, Mr. Sidney, who disliked a college residence, built himself a very pretty house in our neighbourhood, which he called his home, and where he lived, as much as a love of Bath and Brighton and London and Lords would let him. He counted many noble families amongst his near connections, and passed a good deal of his time at their country seats, a life for which he was by character and habit peculiarly fitted. In person he was a tall, stout, gentlemanly man, about 50, or by Our Lady inclining to 60, with fine features, a composed gravity of countenance and demeanour, a bald head most accurately powdered, and a very graceful bow, quite the pattern of an elderly man of fashion. His conversation was in excellent keeping with the calm imperturbability of his countenance and the sedate gravity of his manner, smooth, dull, and commonplace, exceedingly safe, and somewhat imposing. He spoke so little that people really fell into the mistake of imagining that he thought, and the tone of decision with which he would advance some second-hand opinion was well calculated to confirm the mistake. Gravity was certainly his chief characteristic, and yet it was not a clerical gravity either. He had none of the generic marks of his profession. Although perfectly decorous in life and word and thought, no stranger ever took Mr. Sidney for a clergyman. He never did any duty anywhere that I ever heard of, except the agreeable duty of saying grace before dinner, and even that was often performed by some lay host in pure forgetfulness of his guest's ordination. Indeed, but for the direction of his letters, and an eye to the particular rectory, I am persuaded that the circumstance might have slipped out of his own recollection. His quality of old bachelor was more perceptible. There lurked under all his polish, well covered but not concealed, the quiet selfishness, the little whims and precise habits, the primness and priggishness of that disconsolate condition. His man Andrews, for instance, valet, groom, and body servant abroad, butler, cook, caterer, and major domo at home. Tall, portly, powdered, and black-coated as his master, and like him in all things but the knowing pigtail which stuck out horizontally above his shirt-collar, giving a ludicrous dignity to his appearance. Andrews, who, constant as the dial pointed 9, carried up his chocolate and shaving-water, and, regular as the chimes at midnight, prepared his white wine whey, who never forgot his gouty shoe in travelling. Once for 2 days he had a slight touch of that gentlemanly disorder, and never gave him the newspaper unaired. To whom could this jewel of a valet, this matchless piece of clockwork, belong but an old bachelor? And his little dog, Viper, unparagoned of terriers, black, sleek, sharp, and shrewish, who would beg and sneeze and fetch and carry like a Christian, eat olives and sweetmeats and mustard, drink coffee and wine and liqueurs. Who but an old bachelor could have taught Viper his multifarious accomplishments? Little Viper was a most useful person in his way, for although Mr. Sidney was a very creditable acquaintance to meet on the King's highway — your dull man, if he rides well, should never think of dismounting — or even on the level ground of a carpet in the crowd of a large party, yet when he happened to drop in to take a family dinner, a pretty frequent habit of his when in the country, then Viper's talents were inestimable in relieving the ennui occasioned by that grave piece of gentility, his master, not only dull in himself, but the cause of dullness in others. Anything to pass away the heavy hours till whist or piquet relieved the female world from his intolerable silence. In other respects, these visits were sufficiently perplexing. Every housewife can tell what a formidable guest is an epicure who comes to take pot luck, how sure it is to be bad luck, especially when the unfortunate hostess lives 5 miles from a market town. Mr. Sidney always came unseasonably, on washing day or Saturday, or the day before a great party. So sure as we had a scrap dinner, so sure came he. My dear mother, who with true benevolence and hospitality cared much for her guests' comfort and nothing for her own pride, used to grieve over his discomfiture and try all that could be done by potted meats and omelettes and little things tossed up on a sudden to amend the bill of fare. But cookery is an obstinate art and will have its time. However you may force the component parts, there is no forcing a dinner. Mr. Sidney had the evil habit of arriving just as the last bell rang, and in spite of all the hurry-scurry in the kitchen department, the new niceties and the homely dishes were sure to disagree. There was a total want of keeping. The kickshaws were half raw, the solids were mere rags, the vegetables were cold, the soup was scalding, no shallots to the rump steaks, and no mushrooms with the broiled chicken, no fish, no oysters, no ice, and no pineapple. Poor Mr. Sidney! He must have had a great regard for us to put up with our bad dinners. Perhaps the chance of a rubber had something to do with his visits to our house. If there be such a thing as a ruling passion, the love of whist was his. Cards were not merely the amusement, but the business of his life. I do not mean as a money-making speculation, for although he belonged to a fashionable club in London, and to every card meeting of decent gentility within reach of his country home, he never went beyond a regular moderate stake, and could not be induced to bet even by the rashest defier of calculation or the most provoking undervaluer of his play. It always seemed to me that he regarded whist as far too important and scientific a pursuit to be degraded into an affair of gambling. It had, in his eyes, all the dignity of a study, an acquirement equally gentlemanly and clerical. It was undoubtedly his test of ability. He had the value of a man of family and a man of the world for rank and wealth and station and dignities of all sorts. No human being entertained a higher respect for a king, a prince, a prime minister, a duke, a bishop, or a lord. But these were conventional feelings. His genuine and unfeigned veneration was reserved for him who played a good rubber, a praise he did not easily give. He was a capital player himself, and held all his country competitors, except one, in supreme and undisguised contempt, which they endured to admiration. I wonder they didn't send him to Coventry. He was the most disagreeable partner in the world, and nearly as unpleasant an adversary, for he not only enforced the Pythagorean law of science, which makes one hate whist so, but used to distribute quite impartially to everyone at table little disagreeable observations on every card they played. It was not scolding or grumbling or fretting. One has a sympathy with those expressions of feeling, and at the worst can scold again. It was a smooth, polite commentary on the errors of the party, delivered in the calm tone of undoubted superiority with which a great critic will sometimes take a small poet or a batch of poets to task in a review. How the people could bear it! But the world is a good-natured world, and doesn't like a man the less for treating it scornfully. So passed 6 evenings out of the 7 with Mr. Sidney, for it was pretty well known that on the rare occurrence of his spending a day at home without company, his factotum Andrews used to have the honour of being beaten by his master in a snug game at Double Dumby. But what he did with himself on Sunday occasioned me some speculation. Never in my life did I see him take up a book, although he sometimes talked of Shakespeare and Milton and Johnson and Burke in a manner which proved that he had heard of such things, and as to the newspaper, which he did read, that was generally conned over long before night. Besides, he never exhibited spectacles, and I have a notion that he could not read newspaper type at night without them. How he could possibly get through the after-coffee hours on a Sunday puzzled me long. Chance solved the problem. He came to call on us after church and agreed to dine and sleep at our house. The moment tea was over, without the slightest apology or attempt at conversation, he drew his chair to the fire, set his feet on the fender, and fell fast asleep in the most comfortable and orderly manner possible. It was evidently a weekly habit. Every sense and limb seemed composed to it. Viper looked up in his face, curled himself round on the hearthrug, and went to sleep too. And Andrews, just as the clock struck 12, came in to wake him, that he might go to bed. It was clearly an invariable custom, a settled thing. His house and grounds were kept in the neatest manner possible. There was something even disagreeable in the excessive nicety, the Dutch preciseness of the shining gravel walks, the smooth shaven turf of the lawn, and the fine sifted mould of the shrubberies. A few dead leaves or scattered flowers, even a weed or two, anything to take away from the artificial toy-like look of the place would have been an improvement. Mr. Sidney, however, did not think so. He actually caused his gardener to remove those littering plants called roses and gum cistuses. Other flowers fared little better. No sooner were they in bloom than he pulled them up for fear they should drop. Indoors matters were still worse. The rooms and furniture were very handsome, abounding in the luxurious Turkey carpets, the sofas, easy chairs, and ottomans which his habits required, and yet I never in my life saw any house which looked less comfortable. Everything was so constantly in its place, so provokingly in order, so full of naked nicety, and so thoroughly old bachelorish. No work, no books, no music, no flowers. But for those two things of life, viper and a sparkling fire, one might have thought the place uninhabited. Once a year, indeed, it gave signs of animation in the shape of a Christmas party. That was Mr. Sidney's shining time. Nothing could exceed the smiling hospitality of the host or the lavish profusion of the entertainment. It breathed the very spirit of a welcome splendidly liberal, and little Viper frisked and bounded, and Andrew's tail vibrated, I was going to say wagged, with cordiality and pleasure. Andrews, on these occasions, laid aside his customary black in favour of a blue coat and a white silk court waistcoat with a light running pattern of embroidery and silver spangles, assumed to do honour to his master and the company. How much he enjoyed the applause which the wines and the cookery elicited from the gentlemen, and how anxiously he would direct the ladies' attention to a manuscript collection of riddles, the compilation of some deceased countess, laid on the drawing-room table for their amusement between dinner and tea. Once, I remember, he carried his attention so far as to produce a gone-by toy called a bandolore for the recreation of myself and another little girl, admitted by virtue of the Christmas holidays to this annual festival. Poor Andrews! I'm convinced that he considered the entertainment of the visitors quite as much his affair as his master's, and certainly they both succeeded. Never did parties pass more pleasantly. On those evenings, Mr. Sidney even forgot to find fault at whist. At last, towards the end of a severe winter, during which he had suffered much from repeated colds, that certain rectory became vacant, and our worthy neighbour hastened to take possession. The day before his journey he called on us in the highest spirits, anticipating a renewal of health and youth in this favourite spot, and approaching nearer than I had ever heard him to a jest on the subject of looking for a wife. Married or single, he made us promise to visit him during the ensuing summer. Alas! Long before the summer arrived, our poor friend was dead. He had waited for this living 30 years. He did not enjoy it 30 days. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Our Village, Volume 1 by Mary Russell Mitford. Read by Anne Fletcher, Hobart 2020. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Village, Volume 1. Chapter 14. A Village Beau. The finest young man in our village is undoubtedly Joel Brent, half-brother to my Lizzie. They are alike, too, as much alike as a grown-up person and a little child of different sexes well can be. Alike in a vigorous uprightness of form, light, firm, and compact as possible. Alike in the bright, sparkling, triumphant blue eye, the short, curled upper lip, the brown, wavy hair, the white forehead and sunburnt cheeks, and above all, in the singular spirit and gaiety of their countenance and demeanour, the constant expression of life and glee to which they owe the best and rarest part of their attractiveness. They seem, and they are, two of the happiest and merriest creatures that ever trod on the greensward. Really, to see Joel walking by the side of his team, for this enviable mortal, the pride of our village, is by calling a carter, to see him walking on a fine sunny morning by the side of his bell team, the fore-horse decked with ribbons and flowers like a countess on a birthday, as consciously handsome as his driver, the long whip poised gracefully on his shoulder, his little sister in his hand, and his dog Ranger, a beautiful red and white spaniel, everything that belongs to Joel is beautiful, frisking about them. To see this group, and to hear the merry clatter formed by Lizzie's tongue, Joel's whistling, and Ranger's delighted bark, is enough to put an amateur of pleasant sounds and happy faces in good humour for the day. It is a graceful sight in other respects, for Joel is a very picturesque person, just such a one as a painter would select for the foreground of some English landscape, where nature is shown in all her loveliness. His costume is the very perfection of rustic coquetry, of that grace which all admire and few practise, the grace of adaptation, the beauty of fitness. No one ever saw Joel in that wretched piece of deformity, a coat, or that still wretcheder apology for a coat, a dock-tailed jacket. Broadcloth, the common stale of peer and peasant, approaches him not, neither does the poor creature fustian. His upper garment consists of that prettier jacket without skirts, call it for the more grace a doublet, of dark velveteen, hanging open over his waistcoat, giving a Spanish or an Italian air to his whole appearance, and setting off to great advantage his trim yet manly shape. To this he adds a silk handkerchief, tied very loosely round his neck, a shirt collar open so as to show his throat, as you commonly see in the portraits of artists, very loose trousers, and a straw hat. Sometimes in cold weather he throws over all a smock frock, and last winter brought up a fashion amongst our lads by assuming one of that light blue Waterloo, such as butchers wear. As soon as all his comrades had provided themselves with a similar piece of rustic finery, he abandoned his, and indeed generally sticks to his velveteen jacket, which by some magical influence of cleanliness and neatness always looks new. I cannot imagine how he contrives it, but dirt never hangs upon Joel. Even a fall at cricket in the summer or a tumble on the ice in the winter fails to soil him, and he is so ardent in his diversions, and so little disposed to let his coxcombry interfere with his sports, that both have been pretty often tried, the former especially. Ever since William Grey's secession, which took place shortly after our great match, for no cause assigned, Joel has been the leader and chief of our cricketers. Perhaps, indeed, Joel's rapid improvement might be one cause of William's withdrawal, for without attributing anything like envy or jealousy to these fine young men, we all know that two stars keep not their motion in one sphere, and so forth. And if it were absolutely necessary that either our Harry Hotspur or the Prince of Wales should abdicate that fair kingdom, the cricket ground, I must say that I am content to retain our present champion. Joel is in my mind the better player, joining to William's agility and certainty of hand and eye all the ardour, force and gaiety of his own quick and lively spirit. The whole man is in the game, mind and body, and his success is such as dexterity and enthusiasm united must always command. To be sure, he is a little over-eager, and that I must confess, and does occasionally run out a slow mate, but he is sure to make up for it by his own exertions, and after all, what a delightful fault zeal is. Now that we are on the subject of faults, it must be said not that Joel has his share, which is of course, but that they are exceedingly venial, little shades that become him and arise out of his brighter qualities as smoke from the flame. Thus, if he sometimes steals one of his active holidays for a revel or a cricket match, he is sure to make up the loss to his master by a double portion of labour the next day. And if now and then, at tide times, he loiters in the chimney corner of the Rose rather longer than strict prudence might warrant, no one can hear his laugh and his song pouring through the open door like the very voice of jest and youthful jollity, without feeling certain that it is good fellowship and not good liquor that detains him. Indeed, so much is he the delight of the country lads who frequent that well-accustomed inn, so much is his company sought after in all rustic junketings, that I am only astonished at the strength of resolution and power of resisting temptation which he displays in going thither so seldom. If our village lads be so fond of him, it is not to be doubted that our village maidens like him too. The pretty brunette, Sally Wheeler, who left a good service at B to take in needlework and come home to her grandmother, she being, to use Sally's phrase, unkept for want of company, though do note, Dame Wheeler is as deaf as a post, a cannon would not rouse her, is thought in our little world to have had an eye to Joel in this excess of dutifulness, Miss Phoebe, the lass of the Rose, she also, before her late splendid marriage to the pattern maker, is said to have becurled and beflounced herself at least 2 tiers higher on club nights and Sundays and holidays, and whenever there was a probable chance of meeting him. The gay recruiting sergeant and all other beaux were abandoned the instant he appeared. Nay, it is even hinted that the pattern maker owes his fair bride partly to pique at Joel's indifference. Then Miss Sophia Matthews, the schoolmistress on the Lee, to whom, in point of dignity, Miss Phoebe was nothing, who wears a muff and a veil, walks mincingly, and tosses her head in the air, keeps a maid, a poor little drab of 10 years old, follows, as she says, a genteel profession. I think she may have 20 scholars at 8pence a week. And when she goes to dine with her brother, the collar-maker, hires a boy for a penny to carry her clogs. Miss Sophia, it is well known, hath permitted her dignity in the matter of Joel, hath invited the whole family to tea. Only think of Joel at a tea-party. Hath spoken of him as a person above the common, a respectable young man, one who, with a discreet and accomplished wife, a woman of reading and education. Miss Sophia, in the days of her father, the late collar-maker of happy memory, before she taught the young idea how to shoot, had herself drunk deeply at that well of knowledge, the circulating library of B. Not too young. Miss Sophia calls herself 28. I wonder what the register says. No brazen-faced gypsy like Sally Wheeler. Miss Sophia's cast of countenance is altogether different from Sally's dark and sparkling beauty, she being pink-eyed, red-haired, lean, pale, and freckled. Or the Jill flirt of Phoebe. But to cut short a narration, which in spite of the lady's gentility began to grow rather scurrilous, one fact was certain, that Joel might, had he so chosen, have worn the crown matrimonial in Miss Sophia's territories, consisting of a freehold cottage, the little the worse for wear, a good garden, a capital orchard, and an extensive right of common, to say nothing of the fair damsel and her school, or, as she is accustomed to call it, her seminary. Joel's proud bright eye glanced, however carelessly, over all. There was little perceptible difference of feeling in the gay, distant smile with which he regarded the coquettish advances of the pretty brunette Sally Wheeler, or the respectful bow with which he retreated from the undignified condescension of Miss Sophia. He fluttered about our village belles like a butterfly over a bed of tulips, sometimes approaching them for a moment and seeming then ready to fix, but oftener above and out of reach, a creature of a sprightlier element, too buoyant and volatile to light on an earthly flower. At last, however, the rover was caught, and our damsel Harriet had the glory of winning that indomitable heart. Now, Harriet is in all things Lucy's successor, in post and favour and beauty and lovers. In my eye, she is still prettier than Lucy. There is something so feminine and so attractive in her loveliness. She is a tall young woman, finely, though for 18 rather fully formed, with a sweet childlike face, a fair blooming complexion, a soft innocent smile, and the eye of a dove. Add to this a gentle voice, a quiet, modest manner, and a natural gentility of appearance, and no wonder that Harriet might vie with her predecessor in the number of her admirers. She inherited also a spice of her coquetry, although it was shown in so different a way that we did not immediately find it out. Lucy was a flirt active, Harriet was a flirt passive. Lucy talked to her beau, and Harriet only listened to hers. Lucy, when challenged on the number of her conquests, denied the thing, and blushed and laughed, and liked to be laughed at. Harriet, on a similar charge, gave no token of liking or denial, but said quietly that she couldn't help it, and went on winning hearts by dozens, prodigal of smiles but chary of love, till Joel came, pleased her by manners most unlike her own, and gave to her delicate womanly beauty the only charms it wanted, sensibility and consciousness. The manner in which we discovered this new flirtation, which, unlike her others, was concealed with the pretty reserve and mystery that wait on true love, was sufficiently curious. We had noted Joel more frequently than common about the house. Sometimes he came for Lizzie, sometimes to bring news of a cricket match, sometimes to ask questions about bats and balls, sometimes to see if his dog Ranger had followed my May, sometimes to bring me a nosegay. All this occasioned no suspicion. We were too glad to see Joel to think of inquiring why he came. But when the days shortened, and evening closed in dark and cold before his work was done, and cricket and flowers were over, and May and Lizzie safe in their own warm beds, and poor Joel's excuses fairly at an end, then it was that in the after-dinner pause about 7, when the clatter of plates and dishes was over, that the ornithological ear of the master of the house, a dabbler in natural history, was struck by a regular and melodious call, the note, as he averred, of a skylark. That a skylark should sing in front of our house at 7 o'clock on a December evening seemed, to say the least, rather startling. But our ornithologist, happening to agree with Mr. White of Selborne in the opinion that many more birds sing by night than is commonly supposed, and becoming more and more confident of the identity of the note, thought the thing possible, and not being able to discover any previous notice of the fact, had nearly inserted it as an original observation in the naturalist calendar, when running out suddenly one moonlight night to try for a peep at the nocturnal songster, he caught our friend Joel, whose accomplishments in this line we had never dreamt of, in the act of whistling a summons to his lady-love. For some weeks our demure coquette listened to none but this bird-like wooing, partly from pride in the conquest, and partly from real preference, and partly, I believe, from a lurking consciousness that Joel was by no means a lover to be trifled with. Indeed, he used to threaten between jest and earnest a ducking in the goose pond opposite to whoever should presume to approach his fair intended, and the waters being high and muddy, and he at all points a formidable rival, most of her former admirers were content to stay away. At last, however, she relapsed into her old sin of listening. A neighbouring farmer gave a ball in his barn, to which both our lovers were invited and went. Now Harriet loves dancing, and Joel, though arrayed in a new jacket and thin cricketing pumps, would not dance. He said he could not, but that, as Harriet observes, is incredible. I agree with her that the gentleman was too fine. He chose to stand and look on, and laugh and make laugh the whole evening. In the meantime, his fair betrothed picked up a new partner and a new beau, in the shape of a freshly arrived carpenter, a grand martial-looking figure as tall as a grenadier, who was recently engaged as foreman to our civil wheeler, and who, even if he had heard of the denunciation, was of a size and spirit to set Joel and the goose pond at defiance. David might as well have attempted to goose pond Goliath. He danced the whole evening with his pretty partner, and afterwards saw her home, all of which Joel bore with great philosophy. But the next night he came again, and Joel, approaching to give his own skylark signal, was startled at seeing another lover leaning over the wicket, and his faithless mistress standing at the half-open door, listening to the tall carpenter, just as complacently as she was wont to do to himself. He passed on without speaking, turned down the little lane that leads to Dame Wheeler's cottage, and in less than 2 minutes Harriet heard the love-call sounded at Sally's gate. The effect was instantaneous. She discarded the tall carpenter at once and forever, locked and bolted the door, and sat down to work or to cry in the kitchen. She did not cry long. The next night we heard again the note of the skylark, louder and more brilliant than ever, echoing across our court, and the lovers, the better friends for their little quarrel, have been as constant as turtle doves ever since. End of chapter 14. Chapter 28 of Our Village, Volume 1, by Mary Russell Mitford, read by Anne Fletcher, Hobart, 2020. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Village, Volume 1, Chapter 28, The Talking Gentleman. The lords of the creation, who are generally, to do them justice, tenacious enough of their distinctive and peculiar faculties and powers, have yet by common consent made over to the females the single gift of loquacity. Every man thinks and says that every woman talks more than he. It is the creed of the whole sex, the debates and law reports notwithstanding. And every masculine eye that has scanned my title has already, I doubt not, looked to the errata, suspecting a mistake in the gender. But it is their misconception, not my mistake. I do not, heaven forbid, intend to impugn or abrogate our female privilege. I do not dispute that we do excel, generally speaking, in the use of the tongue. I only mean to assert that one gentleman does exist, whom I have the pleasure of knowing intimately, who stands preeminent and unrivalled in the art of talking, unmatched and unapproached by man, woman, or child. Since the decease of my poor friend the talking lady, who dropped down speechless in the midst of a long story about 9 weeks ago, and was immediately known to be dead by her silence, I should be at a loss where to seek a competitor to contend with him in a race of words, and I should be still more puzzled to find one that can match him in wit, pleasantry, or good humour. My friend is usually called Harry L., for though a man of substance, a lord of land, a magistrate, a field officer of militia, nobody ever dreamed of calling him Mr. or Major, or by any such derogatory title. He is and will be all his life plain Harry, the name of universal goodwill. He is indeed the pleasantest fellow that lives. His talk, one can hardly call it conversation, as that would seem to imply another interlocutor, something like reciprocity, is an incessant flow of good things, like Congreve's comedies without a replying speaker, or Joe Miller laid into one, and its perpetual stream is not lost and dispersed by diffusion, but runs in one constant channel, playing and sparkling like a fountain, the delight and ornament of our good town of B. Harry L. is a perfect example of provincial reputation, of local fame. There is not an urchin in the town that hasn't heard of him, nor an old woman that doesn't chuckle by anticipation at his approach. The citizens of B are as proud of him as the citizens of Antwerp were of the chapeau de paille, and they have the advantage of the luckless Flemings in the certainty that their boast is not to be purchased. Harry, like the Flemish beauty, is native to the spot, for he was born at B, educated at B, and married at B, though, as his beautiful wife brought him a good estate in a distant part of the country, there seemed at that epoch of his history some danger of his being lost to our ancient borough. But he is a social and gregarious animal, so he leaves his pretty place in Devonshire to take care of itself, and lives here in the midst of a hive. His tastes are not at all rural. He's no sportsman, no farmer, no lover of strong exercise. When at B, his walks are quite regular, from his own house on one side of the town to a gossip shop called Literary on the other, where he talks and reads newspapers, and others read newspapers and listen. Thence he proceeds to another house of news, similar in kind, though differing in name, in an opposite quarter, where he and his hearers undergo the same process, and then he returns home, forming a pretty exact triangle of about half a mile. This is his daily exercise, or rather his daily walk, Of exercise he takes abundance, not only in talking, though that is nearly as good to open the chest as the dumbbells, but in a general restlessness and fidgetedness of person, the result of his ardent and nervous temperament, which can hardly endure repose of mind or body. He neither gives rest nor takes it. His company is indeed, in one sense, only one, fatiguing. Listening to him tires you like a journey. You laugh till you are forced to lie down. The medical gentlemen of the place are aware of this, and are accustomed to exhort delicate persons to abstain from Harry's society, just as they caution them against temptations in point of amusement or of diet, pleasant but dangerous. Choleric gentlemen should also avoid him, and such as love to have the last word, for though never provoked himself, I cannot deny that he is occasionally tolerably provoking, in politics especially, and he is an ultra-liberal, quotes Cobbett, and goes rather too far. In politics he loves to put his antagonist in a fume, and generally succeeds, though it's nearly the only subject on which he ever listens to an answer, chiefly, I believe, for the sake of a reply, which is commonly some trenchant repartee that cuts off the poor answer's head like a razor. Very determined speakers would also do well to eschew his company, though in general I never met with any talker to whom other talkers were so ready to give way. Perhaps because he keeps them in such incessant laughter that they are not conscious of their silence. To himself, the number of his listeners is altogether unimportant. His speech flows not from vanity or lust of praise, but from sheer necessity. The reservoir is full and runs over. When he has no one else to talk to, he can be content with his own company, and talks to himself, being beyond a doubt greater in a soliloquy than any man off the stage. Where he is not known, this habit sometimes occasions considerable consternation and very ridiculous mistakes. He has been taken alternately for an actor, a poet, a man in love, and a man beside himself. Once in particular, at Windsor, he greatly alarmed a philanthropic sentinel by holding forth at his usual rate while pacing the terrace alone, and but for the opportune arrival of his party and their assurances that it was only the gentleman's way, there was some danger that the benevolent soldier might have been tempted to desert his post to take care of him. Even after this explanation, he gazed with a doubtful eye at our friend, who was haranguing himself in great style, sighed and shook his head, and finally implored us to look well after him till he should be safe off the terrace. "You see, ma'am," observed the philanthropist in scarlet, "it is an awkward place for anybody troubled with vagaries. Suppose the poor soul should take a fancy to jump over the wall." In his externals, he is a well-looking gentleman of 40 or thereabouts, rather thin and rather pale, but with no appearance of ill health, nor any other peculiarity, except the remarkable circumstances of the lashes of one eye being white, which gives a singular non-resemblance to his organs of vision. Every one perceives the want of uniformity, and few can detect the cause. Some suspect him of what farriers call a wall eye. Some think he squints. He himself talks familiarly of his two eyes, the black and the white, and used to liken them to those of our fine Persian cat, now alas no more, who had in common with his feline countrymen one eye blue as a sapphire and the other as yellow as a topaz. The dissimilarity certainly rather spoils his beauty, but greatly improves his wit. I mean the sense of his wit in others. It arrests attention and predisposes to laughter, is an outward and visible sign of the comical. No common man has two such eyes. They're made for fun. In his occupations and pleasures, Harry is pretty much like other provincial gentlemen. Loves a rubber and jests all through at aces, kings, queens, and knaves, bad cards and good, at winning and losing, scolding and praise. loves a play, at which he out-talks the actors whilst on the stage, to say nothing of the advantage he has over them in the intervals between the acts. Loves music as a good accompaniment to his grand solo. Loves a contested election above all. That is his real element, that din and uproar and riot and confusion. To ride that whirlwind and direct that storm is his triumph of triumphs. He would make a great sensation in Parliament himself, and a pleasant one. By the way, he was once in danger of being turned out of the gallery for setting all around him in a roar. Think what a fine thing it would be for the members to have mirth introduced into the body of the House, to be sure of an honest, hearty and good-humoured laugh every night during the session. Besides, Harry is an admirable speaker in every sense of the word. Jesting is indeed his forte, because he wills it to be so, and therefore, because he chooses to play jigs and country dances on a noble organ, even some of his staunchest admirers think he can play nothing else. There is no quality of which men so much grudge the reputation as versatility of talent. Because he is so humorous, they will hardly allow him to be eloquent, and because he is so very witty, find it difficult to account him wise. But let him go where he has not that mischievous fame, or let him bridle his jests and rein in his humour only for one short hour, and he will pass for a most reverend orator, logical, pathetic, and vigorous above all. But how can I wish him to cease jesting even for an hour? Who would exchange the genial fame of good-humoured wit for the stern reputation of wisdom? Who would choose to be Socrates if with a wish he could be Harry L. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Our Village, Volume 1, by Mary Russell Mitford. Read by Anne Fletcher, Hobart, 2020. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Village, Volume 1, Chapter 29, Mrs. Mosse. I do not know whether I ever hinted to the courteous reader that I had been in my younger days, without prejudice to my present condition, somewhat of a spoiled child. The person who, next after my father and mother, contributed most materially to this melancholy catastrophe was an old female domestic, Mrs. Elizabeth Mosse, who at the time of her death had lived nearly 60 years in our house and that of my maternal grandfather. Of course, during the latter part of this long period, the common forms and feelings of a servant and master were entirely swept away. She was a member of the family, a humble friend. Happy are they who have such a friend, living as she liked, upstairs or down, in the kitchen or the nursery, considered, consulted, and beloved by the whole household. Mosse, for by that fondling nursery name she best liked to be called, had never been married, so that the family of her master and mistress had no rival in her heart, and on me, their only child, was concentrated that intensity of affection which distinguishes the attachments of age. I loved her dearly too, as dearly as a spoiled child can love its prime spoiler. But oh, how selfish was my love, compared to the depth and the purity, the indulgence, the self-denial of hers. Dear Mosse, I shall never do her justice, and yet I must try. Mrs. Mosse, in her appearance, was in the highest degree what is called respectable. She must have been tall when young, for even when bent with age she was above the middle height. A large made, though meagre woman, she walked with feebleness and difficulty from the attacks of hereditary gout, which not even her temperance and activity could ward off. There was something very interesting in this tottering helplessness, clinging to the balusters or holding by doors and chairs like a child. It had nothing of vulgar lameness. It told of age, venerable age. Out of doors she seldom ventured, unless on some sunny afternoon I could entice her into the air, and then once around the garden, or to the lawn gate and back again, was the extent of her walk, propped by a very aristocratic walking stick, once the property of a duchess, as tall as herself, with a hooked ivory handle joined to the cane by a rim of gold. Her face was as venerable as her person. She must have been very handsome. Indeed, she was so still, as far as regular and delicate features, a pale brown complexion, dark eyes, still retaining the intelligence and animation of youth, and an expression perfectly gentle and feminine, could make her so. It is one of the worst penalties that woman pays to age, that often when advanced in life, the face loses its characteristic softness. In short, but for the difference in dress, many an old woman's head might pass for that of an old man. This misfortune could never have happened to Mosse. No one could mistake the sex of that sweet countenance. Her dress manifested a good deal of laudable coquetry, a nice and minute attention to the becoming. I do not know at what precise date her costume was fixed, but as long as I remember her, fixed it was, and stood as invariably at one point of fashion as the hand of an unwound clock stands at 1 hour of the day. It consisted, to begin from the feet and describe upwards, of black shoes of shining stuff, with very pointed toes, high heels, and a peak up the instep, showing to advantage her delicately white cotton stockings, and peeping beneath petticoats so numerous and substantial as to give a rotundity and projection almost equal to a hoop. Her exterior garment was always quilted, varying according to the season or the occasion, from simple stuff or fine white dimity, or an obsolete manufacture called Marseille, up to silk and satin. For, as the wardrobes of my 3 grandmothers, I mean my grandfather's 3 wives, had fallen to her lot, few gentlewomen of the last century could boast a greater variety of silks that stood on end. Over the quilted petticoat came an open gown, whose long waist reached to the bottom of her stiff stays, and whose very full tail, about 6 inches longer than the petticoat, would have formed a very inconvenient little train if it had been permitted to hang down. But that inconvenience never happened, and could scarcely have been contemplated by the designer. The tail was constantly looped up, so as to hang behind in a sort of bunchy festoon, exhibiting on each side the aforesaid petticoat. In material, the gown also varied with the occasion, although it was always either composed of dark cotton or of the rich silks and satins of my grandmamma's wardrobe. The sleeves came down just below the elbow, and were finished by a narrow white ruffle meeting her neat mittens. On her neck she wore a snow-white double muslin kerchief pinned over the gown in front and confined by an apron, also of muslin, and over all a handsome silk shawl, so pinned back as to show a part of the snowy neckerchief. Her head-dress was equally becoming and more particularly precise. For if ever she betrayed an atom of old maidishness, it was on the score of her caps. From a touch of the gout in her hands, which had enlarged and stiffened the joints, she could do no work which required nicety, and the successive ladies' maids, on whom the operation devolved, used to say that they would rather make up 10 caps for their mistress than 1 for Mrs. Mosse. And yet the construction seemed simple enough. A fine, plain, clear starch caul, sticking up rather high and peaked in front, was plaited on a Scotch gauze headpiece. I remember there used to be exactly 6 plaits on each side, woe to the damsel who should put more or less, and on the other side a border, consisting of a strip of fine muslin, edged with narrow lace, clear starched and crimped, was plaited on with equal precision. In one part of this millinery I used to assist. I dearly loved to crimp Mosse's frills, and she, with her usual indulgence, used frequently to let me, however, keeping a pretty close eye on her laces and muslins, while I was passing them with triumphant rapidity between the small wooden machine, notched longitudinally, and the corresponding roller. Perhaps a greater proof of indulgence could hardly have been shown, since she must, during this operation, have been in double fear, for her own cap strips, which did occasionally get a rent, and for my fingers, which were sometimes well pinched. Then she would threaten that I should never crimp her muslin again, a never which seldom lasted beyond the next cap-making. The headpiece was then concealed by a satin ribbon fastened in a peculiar bow, something between a bow and a puffing, behind, while the front was adorned with an equally peculiar small knot, of which the two bows were pinned down flat and the two ends left sticking up, cut into scallops of a prodigious regularity. The purchase of the ribbons formed another branch of the cap-making department to which I laid claim. From the earliest period at which I could distinguish one colour from another, I had been purveyor of ribbons to Mosse, and indeed at all fairs, or whenever I received a present or entered a shop, and I was so liberally supplied that there was nothing like generosity in the case, it was the first and pleasantest destination of money that occurred to me, so that the dear woman used to complain that Miss bought her so many ribbons that they spoiled in keeping. We did not quite agree either in our taste. White, as both acknowledged, was the only wear for Sunday and holidays, but then she loved plain white, and I couldn't always control a certain wandering inclination for figured patterns and pearl edges. If Mosse had an aversion to anything, it was to a pearl edge. I never could persuade her to wear that simple piece of finery but once, and then she made as many wry faces as a child eating olives, and stood before a glass, eyeing the obnoxious ribbon with so much discomposure that I was fain to take it out myself and promise to buy no more pearl edges. The everyday ribbons were coloured, and there too we had our little differences of taste and opinion. Both agreed in the propriety of grave colours, but then my reading of a grave colour was not always the same as hers. My eyes were not old enough. She used to accuse my French greys of blueness, and my crimsons of redness, and my greens of their greenness. She had a penchant for brown, and to brown I had a repugnance only to be equalled by that which she professed towards a pearl edge. Indeed, I retain my dislike to this hour. It's such an exceedingly cross and frumpish-looking colour, and then its ugliness. Show me a brown flower. No, I couldn't bring myself to buy brown. So, after fighting many battles about grey and green, we at last settled on purple as a sort of neutral tint, a hue which pleased both parties. To return to the cap which we have been so long making. The finish both to that and to my description was a strip of crimped muslin with edging on both sides to match the border, quilled on a piece of tape and fastened on the cap at each ear. This she called the shinum. A straight short row of hair, rather grey but still very dark for her age, just appeared under the plaited lace, and a pair of silver-mounted spectacles completed her equipment. If I live to the age of 70, I will dress so too, with an exception of the stiff stays. Only a waist native to the fashion could endure that whalebone armour. Her employments were many and various. No work was required of her from her mistress, but idleness was a misery to her habits of active usefulness, and it was astonishing how much those crippled fingers could do. She preferred coarse needlework, as it was least difficult to her eyes and hands, and she attended also to those numerous and undefined avocations of a gentleman's family, which come under the denomination of odd jobs: shelling peas, paring apples, splitting French beans, washing china, darning stockings, hemming and mending dusters and housecloths, making cabbage nets and knitting garters. These were her daily avocations, the amusements which she loved. The only more delicate operation of needlework that she ever undertook was the making of pincushions, a manufacture in which she delighted. Not the quips and quiddities of these degenerate days, little bits of ribboned and pasteboard and gilt paper in the shape of books or butterflies, by which at charitable repositories half a dozen pins are smuggled into a lady's pocket, and shillings and half-crowns are smuggled out. No, Mosse's were real solid old-fashioned silken pincushions, such as Autolycus might have carried about amongst his pedlary ware, square and roomy, and capable, at a moderate computation, of containing a whole paper of short whites and another of middlings. It was delightful to observe her enjoyment of this playwork, the conscious importance with which she produced her satins and brocades and her cards of sewing silks (she generally made a whole batch at once), the deliberation with which she assorted the colours, the care with which she tacked and fitted side to side and corner to corner, the earnestness with which, when all was sewed up except one small aperture for the insertion of the stuffing, she would pour in the bran or stow in the wool. Then the care with which she poked the stuffing into every separate corner, ramming it down with all her strength, and making the little bags, so to say, hold more than it would hold, until it became almost as hard as a cricket ball. Then how she drew the aperture together by main force, putting so many last stitches and fastening off with such care, and then distributing them to all around her, for her ladylike spirit would have scorned the idea of selling them, and always reserving the gayest and prettiest for me. Dear old soul, I have several of them still. But if I should begin to enumerate all the instances of kindness which I experienced at her hands, through the changes and varieties of a troublesome childhood and fantastic youth, from the time when I was a puling baby to the still more exacting state of a young girl at home in the holidays, I should never know when to end. Her sweet and loving temper was self-rewarded. She enjoyed the happiness she gave. Those were pleasant evenings when my father and mother were engaged in the Christmas dinner visits of a gay and extensive neighbourhood, and Mrs. Mosse used to put on her handsomest shawl and her kindest smile, and totter upstairs to drink tea with me and keep me company. From those evenings I imbibed in the first place a love of strong green tea, for which gentlewomanly excitation Mosse had a remarkable predilection, and secondly, a very discreditable and unladylike partiality, which I am quite ashamed, which I keep a secret from my most intimate friends and wouldn't mention for the world, a sort of sneaking kindness for her favourite game of cribbage, an old-fashioned vulgarity which in my mind beats the genteeler pastimes of whist and piquet and every game except quadrille out and out. I make no exception in favour of chess, because, thanks to my stupidity, I never could learn that recondite diversion. Moreover, judging from the grave faces and fatiguing silence of the initiated, I cannot help suspecting that board for board we cribbage players are as well amused as they. Dear Mosse could neither feel to deal and shuffle, nor see to peg, so that the greater part of the business fell to my share. The success was pretty equally divided. 3 rubbers were our stint, and we were often game and game in the last before victory declared itself. She was very anxious to beat, certainly. Note, we never played for anything. She liked to win, and yet she didn't quite like that I should lose. If we could both have won, if it had been 4-handed cribbage, and she my partner, still there would have been somebody to be beaten and pitied. But then that somebody would not have been Miss. The cribbage hour was pleasant, but I think the hours of chat which preceded and followed it were pleasanter still. Mosse was a most agreeable companion, sensible and modest, simple, shrewd, with an exactness of recollection and honesty of memory that gave exceeding interest to her stories. You were sure that you heard the truth. There was one striking peculiarity in her manner of talking, or rather one striking contrast. The voice and accent were quite those of a gentlewoman, as sweet-toned and correct as could be. The words and their arrangement were altogether those of a common person, provincial and ungrammatical in every phrase and combination. I believe it's an effect of association, from the little slips in her grammar, that I have contracted a most unscholarly-like prejudice in favour of false syntax, which is so connected in my mind with right notions that I no sooner catch the sound of bad English than I begin to listen for good sense. And really they often go together, always supposing that the bad English be not of the order called slang. They meet much more frequently than those exclusive people, ladies and gentlemen, are willing to allow. In her they were always united. But the charm of her conversation was in the old family stories and the unconscious peeps at old manners which they afforded. My grandfather, with whom she had lived in his first wife's time, full 20 years before my mother's birth, was a most respectable clergyman, who, after passing a few years in London amongst the wits and poets of the day, seeing the star of Pope in its decline and that of Johnson in its rise, had retired into the country, where he held 2 adjoining livings of considerable value, both of which he served for above 40 years, until the duty becoming too severe, he resigned one of them under an old-fashioned notion that he who did the duty ought to receive the remuneration. I am very proud of my venerable ancestor. We have a portrait of him, taken shortly after he was ordained, in his gown and band, with a curious flowing wig, something like that of a judge, fashionable doubtless at the time, but which at present rather discomposes one's notions of clerical costume. He seems to have been a dark little man, with a sensible countenance, and a pair of black eyes that even in the picture look you through. He was a votary of the Muses, too, a contributor to Lewis's Miscellany. Did my readers ever hear of that collection? Translated Horace, as all gentlemen do, and wrote love verses, which had the unusual good fortune of obtaining their object, being, as Mrs. Mosse was wont to affirm, the chief engine and implement by which at 50 he gained the heart of his third wife, my real grandmamma, the beautiful daughter of a neighbouring squire. Of Dr. R., his wives and his sermons, the bishop who visited, and the poets who wrote to him, Mosse's talk was mainly composed, chiefly of the wives. Mrs. R., the first, was a fine London lady, a widow and considerably older than her spouse, inasmuch as my grandpapa's passion for her commenced when he and her son, by a former husband, were schoolfellows at Westminster. Mrs. Mosse never talked much of her, and I suspect did not much like her, though when closely questioned she would say that Madam was a fine, portly lady, stately and personable, but rather too high. Her son made a sad mésalliance. He ran away with the sexton's daughter, an adventure which cost the sexton his post, and his mother her pride. She never looked up after it. That disgrace and a cold, caught by bumping on a pillion 6 miles through the rain, sent her to her grave. Of the second Mrs. R., little remains on record, except a gown and petticoat of primrose silk, curiously embossed and embroidered with gold and silver thread and silks of all colours, in an enormous running pattern of staring flowers wonderfully unlike nature. Also various recipes in the family receipt book, which show a delicate Italian hand and a bold originality of orthography. The chief event of her married life appears to have been the smallpox. She and 2 of her sisters and Mrs. Mosse were all inoculated together. The other servants, who had not gone through the disorder, were sent out of the house. Dr. R. himself took refuge with a neighbouring friend, and the patients were consigned to the care of 2 or 3 nurses, gossips by profession, hired from the next town. The best parlour, in those days drawing-rooms were not, was turned into a hospital. A quarantine almost as strict as would be required in the plague was kept up, and the preparation, the disease, and the recovery consumed nearly 2 months. Mrs. Mosse always spoke of it as one of the pleasantest passages of her life. None of them suffered much. There was nothing to do, plenty of gossiping, a sense of self-importance, such as all prisoners must feel more or less, and for amusement they had Pamela, the Spectator, and Sir Charles Grandison. My grandfather had a very fine library, but Sir Charles was a female book, having been purchased by the joint contributions of 6 young ladies and circulated amongst them once a year, sojourning 2 months with each fair partner, till death or marriage broke up the coterie. Isn't that fame? Well, the second Mrs. R. died in the course of time, though not of the smallpox, and my grandfather, faithful to his wives, but not to their memories, married again as usual. His third adventure in that line was particularly happy, for my grandmother, besides being a celebrated beauty, appears to have been one of the best and kindest women that ever gladdened a country home. She had a large household, for the tithes of one rich rectory were taken in kind and the glebe cultivated, so that the cares of a farmhouse were added to the hospitality of a man of good fortune, and to the sort of stateliness which in those primitive days appertained to a doctor of divinity. The superintendence of that large household seems to have been at once her duty and her delight. It was a plenty and festivity almost resembling that of Camacho's wedding, guided by a wise and liberal economy and a spirit of indefatigable industry. Oh, the saltings, the picklings, the preservings and cake-makings, the unnamed and unnameable confectionery doings over which she presided. The very titles of her territories denoted the extent of her stores. The apple room, the pear bin, the cheese loft, the minced meat closet were household words as familiar in Mosse's mouth as the dairy or the poultry yard. And my grandmamma was no hoarder for hoarding's sake, no maker of good things which were not to be eaten, as I have sometimes noted amongst your managing ladies. The object of her cares and stores was to contribute to the comfort of all who came within her influence. The large parsonage house was generally overflowing with guests, and from the Oxford professor, who with his wife, children, servants and horses passed his vacations there, to the poor pew opener, who came with her little ones at tide times, all felt the charm of her smiling graciousness, her sweet and cheerful spirit, her open hand and open heart. It is difficult to imagine a happier couple than my venerable grandfather and his charming wife. He retained to the last his studious habits, his love of literature, and his strong and warm family affections, while she cast the sunshine of her innocent gaiety over his respectable age, proud of his scholarship and prouder still of his virtues. Both died long ago, but Mosse was an honest chronicler and never weary of her theme. Even the daily airings of the good doctor, who, in spite of his 3 wives, had a little of the peculiar preciseness in his studies and his exercise which one is apt to attribute exclusively to that dreary person, an old bachelor, even those airings from 12 to 2, 4 miles on the turnpike road and 4 miles back, with the fat horses and the grey-haired coachman, became vivid and characteristic in her description. The very carriage dog, Sancho, was individualized. We felt that he belonged to the people and to the time. Of these things we talked, mingled with many miscellaneous anecdotes of the same date, how an electioneering duke saluted Madam and lost Master's interest by the freedom, how Sir Thomas S., the Lovelace of his day, came in his chariot and 6 full 20 miles out of his way to show himself to Miss Fanny in a Spanish masquerade dress, white satin slashed with blue, a blue cloak embroidered with silver, and point lace that might have won any woman's heart, except that of his fair but obdurate mistress. And lastly, how Henry Fielding, when on a visit in the neighbourhood, had been accustomed to come and swing the children in the great barn, he had even swung Mosse herself, to her no small edification and delight. Only think of being chucked backwards and forwards by the man who wrote about Parson Adams and Squire Allworthy. I used to envy her that felicity. Then from authors we got to books. She could not see in my time to read anything but the folio Bible and Common Prayer Book with which my dear mother had furnished her. But in her younger days she had seen or heard parts at least of a variety of books, and entered into them with a very keen though uncritical relish. Her chief favourites were The Pilgrim's Progress, Don Quixote, Gulliver's Travels, Robinson Crusoe, and the equally apocryphal, but still truer seeming, History of the Plague in London, by the same author, all of which she believed with the most earnest simplicity. I used frequently to read to her the passages she liked best, and she in her turn would repeat to me songs and ballads, good, bad, and indifferent, a strange medley and strangely confounded in her memory. And so the time passed till 10 o'clock. Those were pleasant evenings for her and me. I have sometimes, on recollection, feared that her downstair life was less happy. All that the orders of a mistress could effect for her comfort was done. But we were rich then, unluckily, and there were skipjacks of footmen, and surly coachmen, and affected waiting-maids, and vixenish cooks with tempers red-hot like their coals, to vex and tease our dear old woman. She must have suffered greatly between her ardent zeal for her master's interest and that strange principle of concealing evil doings which servants call honour, and of which she was perpetually the slave and the victim. She had another infirmity too, an impossibility of saying no, which, added to an unbounded generosity of temper, rendered her the easy dupe of the artful and the designing. She would give anything to the appearance of want or the pretence of affection, in short, to importunity, however clothed. It was the only point of weakness in her character, and to watch that she did not throw away her own little comforts to protect her from the effects of her over-liberality was the chief care of her mistress. 3 inferior servants were successively turned away for trespassing on Mosse's goodness, drinking her green tea, eating her diet bread, and begging her gowns. But the evil was incurable. She could dispense with any pleasure except that of giving. So she lived on, beloved as the kind, the gentle, and the generous must be, till I left school, an event that gave her great satisfaction. We passed the succeeding spring in London, and she took the opportunity to pay a long-promised visit to a half-nephew and niece, or rather a half-niece and her husband, who lived in Princes Street, Barbican. Mrs. Beck, one naturally mentions her first as the person of most consequence, was the only real woman who ever came up to the magnificent abstract idea of the fat woman of Brentford, the only being for whom Sir John Falstaff might have passed undetected. She was indeed a mountain of flesh, exuberant, rubicund, and bearded like a man, and she spoke in a loud, deep, mannish voice, a broad Wiltshire dialect. But she was hearty and jovial withal, a thorough good fellow in petticoats. Mr. Beck, on the other hand, was a little, insignificant, perking, sharp-featured man, with a Jerry Sneak expression in his pale whey face, a thin, squeaking voice, and a Cockney accent. He had been lucky enough to keep a little shop in an independent borough at the time of a violently contested election, and having adroitly kept back his vote till votes rose to their full value, I hope this is no breach of privilege, and then voted on the stronger side, he was, at the time of which I speak, comfortably settled in the excise as a tide waiter, had a neat, pretty house, brought up his family in good repute, wore a flaming red waistcoat, attended a dissenting meeting, and owed no man a shilling. These good people were very fond of their aunt, who had indeed, before they were so well off, shown them innumerable kindnesses. Perhaps there might be in the case a little gratitude for favours to come, for she had £300 or £400 to bequeath, partly her own savings and partly a legacy from a distant relative, and they were her natural heirs. However that might be, they paid her all possible attention, and when we were about to return into the country, petitioned so vehemently for a few weeks more, that, yielding to the above-mentioned infirmity, she consented to stay. I had myself been the ambassadress to Barbican to fetch our dear old friend, and I remember as if it were yesterday how earnestly I entreated her to come with me, and how seriously I lectured Mrs. Beck for her selfishness in wishing to keep her aunt in London during the heat of June. I even, after taking leave, sprang out of the carriage and ran again upstairs to persuade her to come with me. Mosse's wishes were evidently on my side, but she had promised, and the performance of her promise was peremptorily claimed. So with a heavy heart I left her. I never saw her again. There is surely such a thing as presentiment. A violent attack of gout in the stomach carried her off in a few hours. Hail to thy memory, for thou wast of the antique world, when service sweat for duty, not for need. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Our Village, Volume 1, by Mary Russell Mitford, read by Anne Fletcher, Hobart 2020. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Village, Volume 1, Chapter 30, Aunt Martha. One of the pleasantest habitations I have ever known is an old white house, built at right angles with the pointed roofs and clustered chimneys of Elizabeth's day, covered with roses, vines, and passion flowers, and parted by a green sloping meadow from a straggling, picturesque village street. In this charming abode resides a more charming family. A gentleman, polite as all his life in courts had been, and good as he the world had never seen, 2 daughters full of sweetness and talent, and Aunt Martha, the most delightful of old maids. She has another appellation, I suppose. She must have one, but I scarcely know it. Aunt Martha is the name that belongs to her, the name of affection. Such is the universal feeling which she inspires, that all her friends, all her acquaintances, in this case the terms are almost synonymous, speak of her like her own family. She's everybody's Aunt Martha, and a very charming Aunt Martha she is. First of all, she is, as all women should be if they can, remarkably handsome. She may be, it's a delicate matter to speak of a lady's age. She must be 45, but few beauties of 20 could stand a comparison to her loveliness. It is such a fullness of bloom, so luxuriating and so satiating, just tall enough to carry off the plumpness, which at 45 is so becoming, a brilliant complexion, curled, pouting lips, long, clear, bright grey eyes, the colour for expression, that which unites the quickness of the black with the softness of the blue, a Roman regularity of feature, and a profusion of rich brown hair. Such is Aunt Martha. Add to this a very gentle and pleasant speech, always kind and generally lively, the sweetest temper, the easiest manner, a singular rectitude and singleness of mind, a perfect open-heartedness, and a total unconsciousness of all of these charms, and you will wonder a little that she is Aunt Martha still. I have heard hints of an early engagement broken by the fickleness of man, and there is about her an aversion to love in one particular direction, the love matrimonial, and an overflowing of affection in all other channels, that it seems as if the natural course of the stream had been violently dammed up. She has many lovers, admirers, I should say, for there is amidst her good-humoured gaiety a coyness that forbids their going farther, a modesty almost amounting to shyness that checks even the laughing girls, who sometimes accuse her of stealing away their beaux. I do not think any man on earth would tempt her into wedlock. It would be a most unpardonable monopoly if anyone should, an intolerable engrossing of a general blessing, a theft from the whole community. Her usual home is the white house covered with roses, and her station in the family is rather doubtful. She's not the mistress, for her charming nieces are old enough to take and adorn the head of the table, nor the housekeeper, though as she is the only lady of the establishment who wears pockets, those ensigns of authority, the keys will sometimes be found, with other strays, in that goodly receptacle. Nor a guest. Her spirit is too active for that lazy post. Her real vocation, there and everywhere, seems to be comforting, cheering, welcoming and spoiling everything that comes in her way, and above all, nursing and taking care. Of all kind employments, these are her favourites. Oh, the shawlings, the cloakings, the cloggings, the cautions against cold, or heat, or rain, or sun, the remedies for diseases not arrived, colds uncaught, and incipient toothaches, rheumatism to come. She loves nursing so well that we used to accuse her of inventing maladies for other people that she might have the pleasure of curing them. And when they really come, as come they will sometimes in spite of Aunt Martha, what a nurse she is. It is worth while to be a little sick, to be so attended. All the cousins and cousins' of her connection as regularly send for her on the occasion of her lying in as for the midwife. I suppose she has undergone the ceremony of dandling the baby, sitting up with the new mamma, and dispensing the caudle 20 times at least. She is equally important at weddings or funerals. Her humanity is inexhaustible. She has an intense feeling of fellowship with her kind, and grieves or rejoices in the sufferings or happiness of others with a reality as genuine as it is rare. Her accomplishments are exactly of this sympathetic order, all calculated to administer much to the pleasure of her companions, and nothing to her own importance or vanity. She leaves to the sirens, her nieces, the higher enchantments of the piano, the harp, and the guitar, and that noblest of instruments, the human voice, ambitious of no other musical fame than such as belongs to the playing of quadrilles and waltzes for their little dances, in which she is indefatigable. She neither caricatures the face of man nor of nature under pretence of drawing figures or landscapes, but she ornaments the reticules, bell-ropes, ottomans, and chair-covers of all her acquaintance with flowers as rich and luxuriant as her own beauty. She draws patterns for the ignorant, and works flounces, frills, and baby linen for the idle. She reads aloud to the sick, plays at cards with the old, and loses at chess to the unhappy. Her gift in gossiping, too, is extraordinary. She's a gentle newsmonger, and turns her scandal on the sunny side. But she is an old maid still, and certain small peculiarities hang about her. She's a thorough hoarder. Whatever fashion comes up, she's sure to have something of the sort by her, or at least something thereunto convertible. She's a little superstitious, sees strangers in her teacup, gifts in her fingernails, letters and winding sheets in the candle, and purses and coffins in the fire. Would not spill the salt for all the worlds that one ever has to give, and looks with dismay on a crossed knife and fork. Moreover, she is orderly to fidgetiness. That's her greatest calamity, for young ladies nowadays are not quite so tidy as they should be, and ladies' maids are so much worse, and drawers are tumbled, and drawing-rooms in a litter. Happy she to whom a disarranged drawer can be a misery. Dear and happy Aunt Martha. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Our Village, Volume 1, by Mary Russell Mitford. Read by Anne Fletcher, Hobart 2020. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Village, Volume 1, Chapter 31, A Parting Glance at Our Village. It is now 18 months since Our Village first sat for its picture, and I cannot say farewell to my courteous readers without giving them some little intelligence of our goings-on, a sort of parting glance at us and our condition. In outward appearance it hath, I suppose, undergone less alteration than any place of its inches in the kingdom. There it stands, the same long straggling street of pretty cottages divided by pretty gardens, wholly unchanged in size or appearance, unincreased and undiminished by a single brick. To be sure, yesterday evening a slight misfortune happened to our goodly tenement, occasioned by the unlucky diligence mentioned in my first notice, which, under the conduct of a sleepy coachman and a restive horse, contrived to knock down and demolish the wall of our court, and fairly to drive through the front garden, thereby destroying sundry curious stocks, carnations, and geraniums. It is a mercy that the unruly steed was content with battering the wall, for the messuage itself would come about our ears at the touch of a finger, and really there is one little end parlour, an afterthought of the original builder, which stands so temptingly in the way that I wonder the sagacious quadruped missed it. There was quite din enough without that addition. The three insides, ladies, squalling from the interior of that commodious vehicle, the outsides, gentlemen, swearing on the roof, the coachman still half asleep but unconsciously blowing his horn, we in the house screaming and scolding, and the passers-by shouting and hallooing, and May, who little brooked such an invasion of her territories, barking in her tremendous lion note and putting down the other noises like a clap of thunder. But passengers, coachmen, horses, and spectators all righted at last, and there's no harm done but to my flowers and to the wall. May, however, stands bewailing the ruins, for that low wall was her favourite haunt. She used to parade backwards and forwards on the top of it, as if to show herself, just after the manner of a peacock on the top of a house, and would sit or lie for hours on the corner next to the gate, basking in the sunshine like a marble statue. Really, she has the air of one who laments the destruction of personal property. But the wall is to be rebuilt tomorrow, with old weather-stained bricks, no patchwork, and exactly in the same form. May herself will not find the difference, so that in the way of alteration this little misfortune will pass for nothing. Neither have we any improvements worth calling such, except that the Wheeler's green door hath been retouched, out of the same pot, as I judge from the tint, with which he furbished up our new old pony chaise, that the shop window of our neighbour, the universal dealer, hath been beautified, and his name and calling splendidly set forth in yellow letters on a black ground, and that our landlord of the Rose hath hoisted a new sign of unparalleled splendour, one side consisting of a full-faced damask rose of the size and hue of a peony, the other of a maiden blush in profile, which looks exactly like a carnation, so that both flowers are considerably indebted to the modesty of the out-of-door artist, who has warily written "The Rose" under each. Except these trifling ornaments, which nothing but the jealous eye of a lover could detect, the dear place is altogether unchanged. The only real improvement with which we have been visited for our sins — I hate all innovation, whether for better or worse, as if I were a furious Tory or a woman of 70. The only misfortune of that sort which has befallen us is underfoot. The road has been adjusted on the plan of Mr. Macadam, and a tremendous operation it is. I do not know what good may ensue, but for the last 6 months some part or other of the highway has been impassable for any feet except such as are shod by the blacksmith, and even the 4-footed people who wear iron shoes make wry faces, poor things, at those stones, enemies to man and beast. However, the business is nearly done now. We are covered with sharp flints, every inch of us, except a bad step up the hill, which indeed looks like a bit cut out of the deserts of Arabia, fitter for camels and caravans than for Christian horses and coaches, a point which, in spite of my dislike of alteration, I was forced to acknowledge to our surveyor, a portly gentleman, who in a smart gig drawn by a prancing steed was kicking up a prodigious dust at that very moment. He and I ought to be great enemies, for besides the macadamite enormity of the stony road, he hath actually been guilty of tree murder, having been an accessory before the fact in the death of 3 limes along the rope walk. Dear, sweet, innocent limes that did no harm on earth except shading the path. I never should have forgiven that offence, had not their removal, by opening a beautiful view from the village up the hill, reconciled even my tree-loving eye to their abstraction. And to say the truth, though we have had 20 little squabbles, there is no bearing malice with our surveyor. He is so civil and good-humoured, has such a bustling and happy self-importance, such an honest earnestness in his vocation, which is gratuitous, by the by, and such an intense conviction that the state of the turnpike road between B and K is the principal affair of this life, that I would not undeceive him for the world. How often have I seen him on a cold winter morning, with a face all frost and business, great-coated up to the eyes, driving from post to post, from one gang of labourers to another, praising, scolding, ordering, cheated, laughed at, and liked by them all. Well, once the hill is finished, we shall have done with him for ever, as he used to tell me by way of consolation, when I shook my head at him as he went jolting along over his dear new roads, at the imminent risk of his springs and his bones. We shall see no more of him, for the macadam ways are warranted not to wear out. So be it. I never wish to see a road mender again. But if the form of outward things be all unchanged around us, if the dwellings of man remain the same to the sight and the touch, the little world within hath undergone its usual mutations. The hive is the same, but of the bees, some are dead and some are flown away, and some that we left insects in the shell are already putting forth their young wings. Children in our village really sprout up like mushrooms. The air is so promotive of growth that the rogues spring into men and women as if touched by Harlequin's wand, and are quite offended if one happens to say or do anything which has a reference to their previous condition. My father grievously affronted Sally L. only yesterday by bestowing upon her a great lump of gingerbread with which he had stuffed his pockets at a fair. She immediately, as she said, gave it to the children. Now Sally cannot be above 12, to my certain knowledge, though taller than I am. Lizzie herself is growing womanly. I actually caught that little lady stuck on a chest of drawers, contemplating herself in the glass, and striving with all her might to gather the rich curls that hung about her neck, and turn them under a comb. Well, if Sally and Lizzie live to be old maids, they may probably make the amende honorable to time, and wish to be thought young again. In the meanwhile, shall we walk up the street? The first cottage is that of Mr. H., the patriot, the illuminator, the independent and sturdy yet friendly member of our little state, who, stout and comely, with a handsome chaise-cart, a strong mare, and a neat garden, might have passed for a portrait of that enviable class of Englishmen who, after a youth of frugal industry, sit down in some retired place to live on their means. He and his wife seemed the happiest couple on earth. Except a little too much leisure, I never suspected that they had one trouble or one care. But care, the witch, will come everywhere, even to that happiest station and this prettiest place. She came in one of her most terrific forms. Blindness, or, which is perhaps still more tremendous, the faint glimmering light and gradual darkness which precede the total eclipse. For a long time we had missed the pleasant bustling officiousness, the little services, the voluntary tasks, which our good neighbour loved so well. Fruit trees were blighted and escaped his grand specific fumigation. Wasps multiplied, and their nest remained untraced. The cheerful, modest knock, with which, just at the very hour when he knew it could be spared, he presented himself to ask for the newspaper, was heard no more. He no longer hung over his gate to waylay passengers and entice them into chat. At last he even left off driving his little chaise, and was only seen moping up and down the garden walk, or stealing gropingly from the woodpile to the house. He evidently shunned conversation or questions, forbade his wife to tell what ailed him, and even when he put a green shade over his darkened eyes, fled from human sympathy with a stern pride that seemed almost ashamed of the humbling infirmity. That strange, but to a vigorous and healthy man perhaps natural, feeling soon softened. The disease increased hourly, and he became dependent on his excellent wife for every comfort and relief. She had many willing assistants in her labour of love. All his neighbours strove to return, according to their several means, the kindness which all had received from him in some shape or other. The country boys, to whose service he had devoted so much time, in shaping bats, constructing bows and arrows, and other quips and trickeries of the same nature, vied with each other in performing little offices about the yard and stable. And John Evans, the half-witted gardener, to whom he had been a constant friend, repaid his goodness by the most unwearied attention. Gratitude even seemed to sharpen poor John's perception and faculties. There is an old man in our parish workhouse who occasionally walks through the street, led by a little boy holding the end of a long stick. The idea of this man, who had lived in utter blindness for 30 years, was always singularly distressing to Mr. H. I shall never forget the address with which our simple gardener used to try to divert his attention from this miserable fellow-sufferer. He would get between them to prevent the possibility of recognition by the dim and uncertain vision, would talk loudly to drown the peculiar noise, the sort of duet of feet, caused by the quick short steps of the child and the slow irregular tread of the old man, and if anyone ventured to allude to blind Robert, he would turn the conversation with an adroitness and acuteness which might put to shame the proudest intellect. So passed many months. At last Mr. H. was persuaded to consult a celebrated oculist, and the result was most comforting. The disease was ascertained to be a cataract, and now with the increase of darkness came an increase of hope. The film spread, thickened, and ripened speedily and healthily, and today the requisite operation has been performed with equal skill and success. You may still see some of the country boys lingering around the gate with looks of strong and wondering interest. Poor John is going to and fro, he knows not for what, unable to rest a moment. Mrs. H., too, is walking in the garden, shedding tears of thankfulness. And he who came to support their spirit, the strong, stout-hearted farmer A., seems trembling and overcome. The most tranquil person in the house is probably the patient. He bore the operation with resolute firmness, and he has seen again. Think of the bliss bound up in those 4 words. He is in darkness now, and must remain so for some weeks, but he has seen, and he will see, and that humble cottage is again a happy dwelling. Next we come to the shoemaker's abode. All is unchanged there, except that its master becomes more industrious and more pale-faced, and that his fair daughter is a notable exemplification of the development which I have already noticed amongst our young things. But she is in the real transition state, just emerging from the chrysalis, and the 18 months between 14½ and 16 would metamorphose a child into a woman all the world over. She is still pretty, but not so elegant as when she wore frocks and pinafores, and, unconsciously classical, parted her long brown locks in the middle of her forehead and twisted them up in a knot behind, giving to her finely shaped head and throat the air of a Grecian statue. Then she was stirring all day in her small housewifery, or her busy idleness, delving and digging in her flower border, tossing and dandling every infant that came within her reach, feeding pigs and poultry, and playing with May, and prattling with an open-hearted frankness to the country lads who assembled at evening in the shop to enjoy a little gentle gossiping. For, be it known to my London readers, that the shoemaker's in a country village is now what, according to tradition and the old novels, the barber's used to be, the resort of all the male newsmongers, especially the young. Then she talked to these visitors gaily and openly, sang and laughed and ran in and out, and took no more thought of a young man than of a gosling. Then she was only 14. Now she wears gowns and aprons, puts her hair in paper, has left off singing, talks, has left off running, and walks, nurses the infants with a grave, solemn grace, and has entirely cut her former playmate Mayflower, who tosses her pretty head as much as to say, "Who cares?" and has nearly renounced all acquaintance with the visitors of the shop, who are by no means disposed to take matters so quietly. There she stands on the threshold, shy and demure, just vouchsafing a formal nod or a faint smile as they pass, and if she in her turn be compelled to pass the open door of their newsroom, for the working apartment is separate from the house, edges along as slyly and mincingly as if there were no such beings as young men in the world. Exquisite coquette! I think she is my opposite neighbour, and I've a right to watch her doings, the right of retaliation. I think there is one youth particularly distinguished by her non-notice, one whom she never will see or speak to, who stands a very fair chance to carry her off. He is called Jem Tanner, and is a fine lad, with an open, ruddy countenance, a clear blue eye, and curling hair of that tint which the poets are pleased to denominate golden. Though not one of our 11, he was a promising cricketer. We have missed him lately on the green at the Sunday evening game, and I find on inquiry that he now frequents a chapel about a mile off, where he is the best male singer, as our nymph of the shoe shop is incomparably the best female. I'm not fond of betting, but I would venture the lowest stake of gentility, a silver threepence, that before the winter ends a wedding will be the result of these weekly meetings at the chapel. In the long dark evenings, when the father has enough to do in piloting the mother with conjugal gallantry through the dirty lanes, think of the opportunity that Jem will have to escort the daughter. A little difficulty he may have to encounter. The lass will be coy for a while, and the mother will talk of their youth, the father of their finances. But the marriage, I doubt not, will ensue. Next in order, on the other side of the street, is the blacksmith's house. Change has been busy here in a different and more awful form. Our sometime constable, the tipsiest of parish officers, of blacksmiths and of men, is dead. Returning from a revel with a companion as full of beer as himself, one or the other, or both, contrived to overset the cart in a ditch. The living scapegrace is pleased to lay the blame of the mishap on the horse, but that is contrary to all probability, this respectable quadruped being a water drinker. And inward bruises, acting on inflamed blood and an impaired constitution, carried him off in a very short time, leaving an ailing wife and 8 children, the eldest of whom is only 14 years of age. This sounds like a very tragical story, yet perhaps because the loss of a drunken husband is not quite so great a calamity as the loss of a sober one, the effect of the event is not altogether so melancholy as might be expected. The widow, when she was a wife, had a complaining, broken-spirited air, a peevish manner and whining voice, a dismal countenance, and a person so neglected and slovenly that it was difficult to believe that she had once been remarkably handsome. She is now quite another woman. The very first Sunday she put on her weeds, we all observed how tidy and comfortable she looked, how much her countenance, in spite of a decent show of tears, was improved, and how completely, through all her sighings, her tone had lost its peevishness. I have never seen her out of spirits or out of humour since. She talks and laughs and bustles about, managing her journeymen and scolding her children as notably as any dame in the parish. The very house looks more cheerful. She has cut down the old willow trees that stood in the court, and let in the light, and now the sun glances brightly from the casement windows, and plays amidst the vine leaves and the clusters of grapes which cover the walls. The door is newly painted, and shines like the face of its mistress. Even the forge has lost half its dinginess. Everything smiles. She indeed talks by fits of poor George, especially when any allusion to her old enemy, mine host of the Rose, brings the deceased to her memory. Then she bewails, as is proper, her dear husband and her desolate condition, calls herself a lone widow, sighs over her 8 children, and complains of the troubles of business, and tries to persuade herself and others that she is as wretched as a good wife ought to be. But this will not do. She's a happier woman than she has been any time these 15 years, and she knows it. My dear village husbands, if you have a mind that your wives should be really sorry when you die, whether by a fall from a cart or otherwise, keep from the ale-house. Next comes the tall, thin, red house that ought to boast genteeler inmates than its short, fat mistress, its children, its pigs, and its quantity of noise, happiness, and vulgarity. The din is greater than ever. The husband, a merry, jolly tar, with a voice that sounds as if issuing from a speaking trumpet, is returned from a voyage to India, and another little one, a chubby, roaring boy, has added his lusty cries to the family concert. This door, blockaded by huge bales of goods, and half darkened by that moving mountain, the tilted waggon of the S. Mill, which stands before it, belongs to the village shop. Increase has been here, too, in every shape. Within 14 months, 2 pretty little quiet girls have come into the world. Before Fanny could well manage to totter across the road to her good friend the nymph of the shoe shop, Margaret made her appearance, and poor Fanny, discarded at once from the maid's arm and her mother's knee, degraded from the ranks and privileges of the baby, for at that age precedence is strangely reversed, would have had a premature foretaste of the instability of human felicity, had she not taken refuge with that best of nurses, a fond father. Everything thrives about the shop, from the rosy children to the neat maid and the smart apprentice. No room now for lodgers, and no need. The young mantua-making schoolmistresses, the old inmates, are gone, one of them not very far. She grew tired of scolding little boys and girls about their ABC, and of being scolded in her turn by their sisters and mothers about pelisses and gowns. So she gave up both trades almost a year ago, and has been ever since our pretty Harriet. I do not think she has ever repented of the exchange, though it might not perhaps have been made so soon, had not her elder sister, who had been long engaged to an attendant at one of the colleges of Oxford, thought herself on the point of marriage just as our housemaid left us. Poor Betsy! She had shared the fate of many a prouder maiden, wearing out her youth in expectation of the promotion that was to authorize her union with the man of her heart. Many a year had she waited in smiling constancy, fond of William in no common measure, and proud of him, as she well might be. For when the vacation so far lessened his duties as to render a short absence practicable, and he stole up here for a few days to enjoy her company, it was difficult to distinguish him in air and manner as he sauntered about in elegant indolence with his fishing-rod and his flute, from the young Oxonians his masters. At last promotion came, and Betsy, apprised of it by an affectionate and congratulatory letter from his sister, prepared her wedding clothes and looked hourly for the bridegroom. No bridegroom came. A second letter announced with regret and indignation that William had made another choice, and was to be married early in the ensuing month. Poor Betsy! We were alarmed for her health, almost for her life. She wept incessantly, took no food, wandered recklessly about from morning till night, lost her natural rest, her flesh and her colour, and in less than a week she was so altered that no one would have known her. Consolation and remonstrance were alike rejected, till at last Harriet happened to strike the right chord by telling her that she wondered at her want of spirit. This was touching her on the point of honour. She had always been remarkably high-spirited, and could as little brook the imputation as a soldier or a gentleman. This lucky suggestion gave an immediate turn to her feelings. Anger and scorn succeeded to grief. She wiped her eyes, hemmed away a sigh, and began to scold most manfully. She did still better. She recalled an old admirer who, in spite of repeated rejections, had remained constant in his attachment, and made such good speed that she was actually married the day before her faithless lover, and is now the happy wife of a very respectable tradesman. Ah, the in-and-out cottage, the dear, dear home. No weddings there, no changes, except that the white kitten who sits purring at the window under the great myrtle has succeeded to his lamented grandfather, our beautiful Persian cat. I cannot find one alteration to talk about. The wall of the court, indeed, but that'll be mended tomorrow. Here is the new sign, the well-frequented Rose Inn. Plenty of changes there. Our landlord is always improving, if it be only a pigsty or a watering trough. Plenty of changes, and one splendid wedding. Miss Phoebe is married, not to her old lover, the recruiting sergeant, for he had one wife already, probably more, but to a pattern-maker, as arrogant a dandy as ever wore mustachios. How Phoebe could abase her eyes from the stately sergeant to this youth, half a foot shorter than herself, whose waist would go into any alderman's thumb-ring, might, if the final choice of a coquette had ever been a matter of wonder, have occasioned some speculation. But our pattern-maker is a man of spirit, and the wedding was of extraordinary splendour. 3 gigs, each containing 4 persons, graced the procession, besides numerous carts and innumerable pedestrians. The bride was equipped in muslin and satin, and really looked very pretty, with her black sparkling eyes, her clear brown complexion, her blushes and her smiles. The bridemaidens were only less smart than the bride, and the bridegroom was point device in his accoutrements, and as munificent as a nabob. Cakes flew about the village, plum puddings were abundant, and strong beer, aye, even mine host's best double X, was profusely distributed. There was all manner of eating and drinking, with singing, fiddling, and dancing between, and in the evening, to crown all, there was Mr. Moon the conjurer. Think of that stroke of good fortune! Mr. Moon, the very pearl of all conjurers, who had the honour of puzzling and delighting their late majesties with his wonderful and pleasing exhibition of thaumaturgics, tachygraphy, mathematical operations, and magical deceptions, happened to arrive about an hour before dinner, and commenced his ingenious deceptions very unintentionally at our house. Calling to apply for permission to perform in the village, being equipped in a gay scarlet coat, and having something smart and sportsmanlike in his appearance, he was announced by Harriet as one of the gentlemen of the sea hunt, and mistaken, I should have said, by the whole family for a certain captain newly arrived in the neighbourhood. That misunderstanding, which must, I think, have retaliated on Mr. Moon a little of the puzzlement that he inflicts on others, vanished, of course, at the production of his bill of fare, and the requested permission was instantly given. Never could he have arrived in a happier hour. Never were spectators more gratified or more scared. All the tricks prospered. The cock crew after his head was cut off, and half-crowns and sovereigns flew about as if winged. The very wedding ring could not escape Mr. Moon's incantations. We heard of nothing else for a week. From the bridegroom, an esprit fort, who defied all manner of conjuration and diablerie, down to my Lizzie, whose boundless faith swallows the Arabian tales, all believed and trembled. So thoroughly were men, women, and children impressed with the idea of the worthy conjurer's dealings with the devil, that when he had occasion to go to B, not a soul would give him a cart, from pure awe, and if it had not been for our pony chaise, poor Mr. Moon must have walked. I hope he is really a prophet, for he foretold all happiness to the new married pair. So this pretty white house with the lime trees before it, which has been under repair for these 3 years, is on the point of being finished. The vicar has taken it, as the vicarage house is not yet fit for his reception. He has sent before him a neat, modest maidservant, whose respectable appearance gives a character to her master and mistress. A hamper full of flower roots, sundry boxes of books, a pianoforte, and some simple, useful furniture. Well, we shall certainly have neighbours, and I have a presentiment that we shall find friends. Lizzie, you may now come along with me round the corner and up the lane, just to the end of the Wheeler's shop, and then we shall go home. It's high time. What is this affiche in the parlour window? Apartments to let. Inquire within. These are certainly the curate's lodgings. Is he going away? I suppose the new vicar will do his own duty. Yet, however well he may do it, rich and poor will regret the departure of Mr. B. Well, I hope that he may soon get a good living. Lodgings to let. Who ever thought of seeing such a placard hereabout? The lodgings, indeed, are very convenient for a single gentleman, a man and his wife, or 2 sisters, as the newspapers say. Comfortable apartments, neat and tasty withal, and the civilest of all civil treatment from the host and hostess. But who ever would have dreamt of such a notice? Lodgings to let in our village. End of chapter 31. End of Volume 1 of Our Village by Mary Russell Mitford.